Hey guys, tonight we're going to snuggle in and talk about something slightly less glamorous than knights and castles, but maybe just as fraught with tension. What medieval people did when they, well, really couldn't wait until marriage. Imagine yourself centuries ago, maybe shivering a little in your thin wool tunic, the firelight flickering across rough stone walls. Outside, it's muddy and cold. Maybe a pig squeals nearby, and the concept of personal space or alone time barely exists. You're living in a world where everyone knows your business, from the moment you wake up to the moment you collapse onto your straw mattress. Love, lust, attraction, these things were just as real then as now, but navigating them before saying I do, or whatever the medieval equivalent was a complex, risky dance under the ever-watchful eyes of neighbors, family, and the church. Let's be honest, the societal pressures and lack of basic plumbing alone probably cured a lot of impetuous urges, but certainly not all. You probably won't survive the sheer discomfort of imagining medieval personal hygiene practices, let alone their dating scene. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you were listening from tonight and what time it is. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the edge of a small medieval village, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, animal dung, and something vaguely rotten from the communal waste heap. This isn't some romanticized fairy tale. This is life, raw and undeniably pungent. You're surrounded by thatch-roofed cottages huddled together, a small church spire poking up towards the often gray sky. Privacy, as you understand it, simply doesn't exist here. Your home is likely a single or maybe two-room dwelling, shared not just with your immediate family, but potentially with extended relatives, livestock seeking warmth, and certainly a generous population of fleas and other less visible companions. Forget closing your bedroom door for a moment of quiet reflection or, no, anything else. There are no bedroom doors in the modern sense and very little alone time to reflect in. You eat together, you sleep together, you work the fields or the forge or the loom in close proximity to others. Your life is an open book, constantly being read and often judged by your neighbors. In this intensely communal world, relationships, especially those with romantic or physical potential, were absolutely central to the social order. Marriage wasn't primarily about two soulmates finding each other after a whirlwind courtship involving whispered secrets and shared glances over steaming mugs of ale. While affection could and did develop, marriage was fundamentally an economic and social contract. It was about joining families, consolidating land or trade skills, producing legitimate heirs, and ensuring the continuity of the family unit and its place within the village hierarchy. Love was a bonus, maybe something that grew. After the wedding, like a particularly resilient weed in a rocky field. The path to marriage was often long and involved negotiations between families, sometimes starting when the prospective couple were still children. You might find yourself betrothed to someone you barely knew. Their suitability based on their dowry, their family's reputation, or the size of their father's farm, not whether they made your heart flutter. Given this backdrop, the idea of pursuing a physical relationship before this complex, public, and often family-driven process reached its formal conclusion was, to put it mildly, complicated. It wasn't just a personal choice with potential social awkwardness. It was a significant challenge to the established order. The village, the manor lord, and above all the church had a vested interest in maintaining control over where and how new families were formed and new lives were brought into the world. Illegitimacy was a serious issue, potentially creating property disputes, burdening the community if a single mother couldn't support the child, and generally upsetting the neat, albeit often grubby, tapestry of medieval society. So, any stirrings of affection, any illicit hand-holding behind the barn, any whispered promises under the moon were happening under a microscope. A dusty, flea-bitten, slightly judgmental microscope, but a microscope nonetheless. Think about the sheer lack of opportunity. Your days are structured by the demands of agricultural labor, craft production, or household chores from sunup to sundown. Evenings are often spent huddled together for warmth and company, maybe listening to stories or patching clothes by firelight. There's no slipping out for a clandestine coffee date, no late-night drives, no anonymous hookups facilitated by dating apps. Thank goodness. Can you imagine medieval Tinder? Swipe right for Bartholomew, smells vaguely of sheep, owns 3 chickens, can fix a plow. Any time you spent with someone, especially someone of the opposite sex outside your immediate family, was visible. If you were seen talking to someone a bit too long by the village well, or walking together down a path outside the village boundaries, tongues would start wagging before you'd even made it back to your hovel. The pressure wasn't just external, it was internalized. You'd been raised in a culture saturated with religious doctrine, taught from birth that certain behaviors were sinful and displeasing to God. The fear of eternal damnation was a very real and potent force. While people undoubtedly fell short of the church's impossibly high standards, we'll get to those strict rules in the next section, buckle up. The knowledge that your soul was on the line added another layer of gravity to any decision to step outside the prescribed boundaries of acceptable conduct. It wasn't just about avoiding a fine or public humiliation. It was about avoiding hellfire. Pretty strong deterrent, even if you were feeling particularly rebellious one Tuesday. Imagine the sheer discomfort of it all, too. You're wearing scratchy, ill-fitting clothes that probably haven't been washed recently. You're likely a bit hungry. Maybe you have a persistent cough. And honestly, everyone around you smells. The romantic tension you might feel is constantly battling with the sheer physical realities of medieval existence. It takes a certain level of determination, or perhaps just youthful foolishness, to pursue a secret relationship when you're also worried about the harvest failing, a neighbor's cow escaping, or whether you have enough fuel for the fire tonight. It wasn't the clean, stylized romance you see in movies. It was gritty, difficult, and fraught with practical as well as moral dangers. Historians still argue whether the average medieval person truly internalized all the strictures placed upon them, or if there was a constant undercurrent of quiet defiance and finding loopholes. It's easy to paint a picture of total control, but human nature is rarely so easily contained. People found ways to connect, to express affection, and yes, to pursue physical relationships, even when society told them they shouldn't. The very existence of laws, punishments, and sermons railing against premarital behavior tells us that it was happening, and likely happening with enough frequency to be a persistent problem for the authorities. If nobody was doing it, they wouldn't need to keep threatening you with hellfire and public stocks, right? The structure of medieval life itself, while limiting, also sometimes created unexpected opportunities. Communal labor like harvesting or threshing brought young men and women together. Village festivals, Saints' Day celebrations, or even trips to market in a nearby town could provide fleeting moments away from the most intense scrutiny, chances for a whispered word or a shared glance that might ignite something more. But these moments were brief and risky. Getting caught could unravel everything, not just for you, but potentially for your family's reputation and future prospects. It was a high-stakes game of hide and seek, played out not in a backyard, but in the limited shadows of a world bathed in the harsh light of collective oversight. Your reputation was everything, and a single misstep could tarnish it for years, making a good marriage, the approved kind, harder to secure, and potentially leaving you ostracized. This intense focus on public perception and communal judgment is perhaps the single most important factor to understand when we think about medieval relationships outside of marriage. It wasn't just a private matter, it was a public performance, and any deviation was noted and commented upon. And let's be honest, people love to comment, especially when it's not about them. It's like medieval reality TV, but with actual consequences beyond getting voted off the island. Imagine the village gossip circle as the original Twitter, but every tweet was delivered verbally, with dramatic pauses and meaningful glances, and could genuinely ruin your life. So as you settle deeper into your bed tonight, try to imagine the sheer, inescapable publicness of it all, the impossibility of truly being alone, the constant pressure to conform, the weighty expectations of family and community resting on your shoulders. This is the world in which any desire to jump the gun, to explore intimacy before the societal and religious green light had to navigate. It wasn't just about personal feelings. It was about fitting into a rigid social structure that had very little tolerance for individual deviation, especially when it came to sex and marriage. Getting caught wasn't just embarrassing. It could dismantle your future, your family's standing, and potentially put you on the path to facing some pretty unpleasant consequences, both in this life and, medieval folks genuinely believed, in the next. The stage is set, the audience is watching and judging, and our medieval hopefuls are navigating this minefield with nothing but whispered words and stolen moments. As you navigated that incredibly public and challenging landscape of medieval life, you weren't just dealing with nosy neighbors and judgmental relatives. Towering over every aspect of existence, shaping thoughts and dictating behavior from cradle to grave, was the immense, pervasive authority of the Catholic Church. Forget separation of church and state. The church was deeply intertwined with every layer of society, its doctrines and rules carrying immense weight, not just morally, but often legally and socially as well. And when it came to sex, marriage, and relationships, the church had a lot to say, and most of it boiled down to, don't do that unless we say so, and even then be careful. The fundamental teaching was stark and simple. Sex was primarily for procreation, intended by God to occur only within the divinely sanctioned union of marriage. Any sexual activity outside of this context was, by definition, sinful. This wasn't just a minor infraction like stealing an apple from the orchard. Depending on the specifics, it could be classified as a mortal sin, a grave offense against God that could condemn your soul to eternal hellfire if you died without repenting and receiving absolution. Imagine living every day with the genuine, terrifying belief that a single moment of weakness, a single transgression, could literally send you to burn forever. That's a pretty heavy burden to carry, especially when your biological urges might be telling you something else entirely. The church had a whole taxonomy of sins, and illicit sex fell under various headings. The most common, and the one most directly relevant to our topic tonight, was fornication, Latin, fornicatio. This specifically meant sexual intercourse between unmarried individuals. Simple, direct, and in the church's eyes, a serious sin. If one of the individuals involved was married, then the sin escalated dramatically to adultery, adulterium, considered even worse because it violated the sanctity of marriage vows. And then there were other related sins, like lust, luxuria, the sinful desire itself, even without the act. This meant even thinking about someone in a way the church deemed inappropriate could put your soul at risk. It wasn't enough to just keep your hands to yourself. You had to police your thoughts too. Talk about a mental workout. How were these rules enforced and internalized? Well, you would have been hearing about them constantly. Sermons in church weren't just dry theological lectures. They were vivid, often terrifying portrayals of the consequences of sin, complete with graphic descriptions of hell and the torments awaiting the damned. Imagine sitting on a hard wooden bench, maybe half asleep after a long week of backbreaking labor, and hearing a fiery sermon about how the flames of hell lick at the souls of fornicators. It probably woke you up pretty quickly. These messages were reinforced through religious imagery in churches, frescoes and stained glass depicting the Last Judgment, where sinners, including those guilty of sexual misconduct, were shown being dragged off by demons. Even if you were illiterate, you could read the writing on the wall, quite literally. But the most direct and personal way the church exerted control over sexual behavior was through the sacrament of confession. By the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, Catholics were required to confess their sins to a priest at least once a year, usually around Easter, and receive communion. Confession was a mandatory spiritual checkup, and priests were trained to ask probing questions to uncover hidden sins, especially sexual ones, which were often considered particularly difficult to confess due to shame. You would kneel before your confessor, recount your transgressions, and the priest would then assign a penance as a form of atonement and a way to purify your soul. Penances varied depending on the severity of the sin and the status of the sinner. Simple fornication might earn you a certain number of paternosters, our fathers, or Ave Marias, Hail Marys, to recite, or maybe a day or two of fasting. More serious or repeated offenses could result in much harsher penances, weeks or months of strict fasting, eating only bread and water, for instance, wearing sackcloth, extended periods of prayer, or even undertaking a pilgrimage to a distant holy site, which was a costly, dangerous, and time-consuming ordeal. In some cases, particularly for persistent offenders or those who cause public scandal, the penance might include a period of public humiliation or exclusion from the community. Imagine having to stand outside the church door during Mass, holding a candle, so everyone could see you were a sinner. Your social credit score would plummet instantly. The confessional was a powerful tool because it made sin a private matter between the individual and God, mediated by the priest. But it also provided the church with incredible insight into the private lives and moral struggles of the populace. Priests, often armed with confessional manuals that detailed every imaginable sin and how to ask about it, were essentially spiritual detectives probing the conscience. These manuals sometimes contained astonishingly specific questions about various sexual acts, roots of transmission of sin, and even sinful thoughts, suggesting that priests were leaving no stone unturned in their quest for spiritual purity among their flock. You might go in expecting to confess stealing a chicken and suddenly find yourself being grilled about that lingering look you gave Bartholomew by the well. This leads us to a fascinating point of debate among historians. How effective was this religious pressure? Really? Historians still argue whether the average medieval person truly internalized the church's doctrines on sex to the point of complete compliance, or if there was a significant gap between the ideal taught from the pulpit and the reality of people's lives. Was the fear of hell a constant, paralyzing force, or something people worried about mainly on their deathbeds or during confession? Did people strategically confess minor sins to distract from major ones? Did they seek out priests known to be more lenient? While the church certainly intended its teachings to be absolute and universally followed, human nature is, and always has been, messy and complicated. People fell in love or lust. They made mistakes. They succumbed to temptation, just as they do today. The very existence of detailed confessional manuals listing countless variations of sexual sin suggests that priests encountered these transgressions frequently, not just as rare occurrences. If everyone was perfectly adhering to the rules, the confessors wouldn't need a guidebook thicker than a brick just for sorting out sexual misdeeds. It's also important to remember that while the church was a monolithic institution in many ways, its enforcement could vary locally. A strict, zealous priest might impose harsher penances than a more understanding or perhaps overburdened one. The influence of the local lord, the strength of community ties, and regional customs also played a role. A particularly conservative village might ostracize someone caught in a compromising situation far more severely than a more transient or urban community. A quirky tidbit about the confessional. Some confessional manuals included incredibly detailed and graphic questions about sexual practices, seemingly designed to ferret out every possible deviation from the church's narrow definition of acceptable conjugal relations. The sheer specificity of some of the questions suggests a certain level of, shall we say, fascination with the topic on the part of the clergy writing these guides. It's almost like they were accidentally providing a medieval guide to forbidden acts while trying to catalog sins. Have you, good parishioner, engaged in insert bizarre, complex scenario involving farm animals and kitchen utensils? No? Okay, just checking. Moving on. The mainstream historical fact here is undeniable. The medieval church held immense power in defining and regulating morality, particularly sexual morality. Its doctrines provided the framework within which people understood sin, salvation, and the proper order of relationships. This wasn't just background noise, it was the operating system for moral decision-making, constantly reinforced through ritual, preaching, and the intimate practice of confession. So for someone in medieval times contemplating getting intimate before marriage, the calculation wasn't just about potential pregnancy or social shame, though those were huge. It was also about risking eternal damnation. It was about facing uncomfortable and potentially humiliating questions in confession. It was about the possibility of being assigned a grueling penance. The church's teachings cast a long shadow, adding a profound spiritual weight to any transgression. It made the decision to step outside the lines not just a social risk, but a potentially catastrophic risk to your immortal soul. It's hard to imagine that level of religiously instilled fear in our secularized world, but it was a very real part of the medieval psyche. It's like having a tiny, disapproving priest living inside your head, constantly tallying up your potential penances. And he has a really long list of prayers for you to say. Better hope you don't forget which one you're on. Despite this powerful deterrent, people did engage in premarital relationships. This tells us something fundamental about human desire, the complexities of real-life situations, and perhaps the limits of institutional control. It meant finding ways around the rules, compartmentalizing beliefs, or perhaps just hoping that confession and penance would sort it out later. The tension between the church's strict ideals and the messy reality of human behavior is a constant theme throughout medieval history, and nowhere is it more apparent than in the realm of love, sex, and marriage. Navigating this meant constantly balancing earthly desires against eternal consequences, hoping you didn't slip up too badly or, worse, get caught by the priest and the village gossip. It was a spiritual tightrope walk, often performed in the dark, and the fall looked pretty terrifying. So you've got the church breathing down your neck about sex outside of marriage. That's the bad news, the don't do that part. But the church wasn't just about prohibitions. It also offered the one sanctioned avenue for sexual activity, the holy sacrament of marriage. This was the church's approved, God-ordained box for everything related to coupling up and making little medieval humans. Within the bounds of marriage, sex was not only permissible, but, for procreation, even encouraged. It was seen as the proper, righteous setting for union, blessed by God and binding until death, with very few exceptions, which were incredibly hard to get through the medieval church bureaucracy. Divorce as we know it today was essentially impossible. You might get an annulment, but that was more like saying the marriage never happened in the first place, which was a high bar. Over centuries, the church had progressively asserted its authority over marriage. Initially, marriage had often been more of a private family or community affair, involving property transfers and vows exchanged with family witnesses. But the church gradually defined it as a sacrament, a sacred rite administered by God himself through the consent of the couple, often formalized before a priest, though as we'll see that before a priest part wasn't always strictly necessary in the eyes of early canon law, leading to all sorts of fun chaos. This meant marriage wasn't just a contract, it was a spiritual bond, making it indissoluble and subject to church law. The essential elements for a valid marriage in the church's eyes ultimately boil down to two main things: consent and consummation. The consent had to be freely given by both parties, saying something like, "I take you as my wife/husband," in the present tense, vows in the future tense like "I will take you," were considered a binding betrothal or espousal, but not the marriage itself, though they often led to confusion. This emphasis on consent, theoretically at least, elevated the wishes of the individuals over purely familial or feudal arrangements. It sounds lovely and romantic, doesn't it? Just two people declaring their love and commitment. Except this is where the messy reality of medieval life crashed headfirst into the church's spiritual ideal. While the church preached consent and the sacred bond, the practical realities of medieval society dictated that marriage was very often, perhaps primarily, an economic and social contract between families. For peasants, marriage might mean combining small landholdings or labor pools to increase their chances of survival. For the nobility and wealthy merchants, marriages were crucial alliances, cementing political power, securing trade routes, consolidating property, and ensuring the continuation of important bloodlines. Your personal feelings, your dazzling smile, your shared love of falconry, or collecting particularly round pebbles? Less important than the dowry you brought with you, the lands your family controlled, or the advantageous connections your union would create. Parents, guardians, and feudal lords had a vested interest in who you married, and their interests frequently trumped your own budding affections. A young noblewoman might be married off to a much older man she'd never met to secure a border alliance. A peasant's son might be pushed to marry the daughter of a neighbor to pool resources in labor. Free consent? Sure, the church said it was necessary, but try telling your powerful, terrifying father that you don't consent to marrying his best friend's ugly, toothless nephew because you're actually in love with the penniless stable boy. Good luck surviving that conversation, let alone getting it recognized by the church courts. This created immense tension. The church said marriage was valid with consent, even without parental approval or a formal ceremony, particularly in earlier periods of the Middle Ages. Families in secular law emphasize property, status, and public agreements, often demanding formal contracts and public solemnization. This divergence opened up a massive loophole for clandestine marriages, unions where two people exchange vows privately, perhaps just between themselves or with only a couple of friends as witnesses, without parental permission, without the banns being called in church, announcements of intent to marry, allowing objections, and often without a priest present initially. Why would you enter into a clandestine marriage? Well, maybe you genuinely fell in love with someone your family would never approve of. The stable boy, the daughter of a rival family, someone too poor or too low status. Maybe you were desperate to legitimize a pregnancy that resulted from that premarital activity we talked about. Maybe you wanted to get married quickly to avoid being forced into another match. Or perhaps you simply couldn't afford the fees and celebrations associated with a public, formal wedding. It was the medieval equivalent of eloping, but with potentially much graver consequences if things went wrong. In the eyes of early canon law, these clandestine marriages, despite lacking publicity and parental consent, were often considered valid if the couple had exchanged consent in the present tense, I take you, and especially if they had subsequently consummated the union. Consummation was seen as the physical seal on the spiritual bond. This caused absolute chaos for families and secular authorities. Imagine planning a strategic marriage for your daughter to the Duke of Whatsittville, only to discover she secretly exchanged vows in the hayloft with a wandering jongleur last year, and the church court might actually uphold that marriage as valid. Your carefully constructed alliance. Poof. Your daughter's inheritance? Now tied to a guy who sings songs for a living. This wasn't exactly the orderly society the powerful wanted. So while the church's ideal was a sacred, consensual union, the reality was a tangled mess of conflicting interests, the couple's potential desire or lack thereof, the family's economic and social strategy, the church's evolving legal framework, and the secular authorities' need for clear property and inheritance rules. The church spent centuries trying to gain more control over marriage, pushing for public ceremonies, the calling of banns, in the presence of a priest, precisely to stamp out these confusing, inconvenient clandestine unions. By the later Middle Ages, the pressure to marry publicly was much stronger, though secret marriages never entirely disappeared. It was just too tempting a loophole for young lovers or desperate souls. This tension between the church's doctrine and social reality is a major point of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether clandestine marriage was primarily an expression of agencies for individuals, particularly women or those of lower status, allowing them to escape arranged marriages and follow their hearts or loins, or if it was mostly a strategy for seduction, where a man might trick a woman into exchanging vows to get her into bed, promising marriage while having no intention of upholding it publicly. The truth, of course, is likely a complex mix, varying greatly depending on the individuals, their social standing, and the specific circumstances. Was it a romantic rebellion against oppressive parents, or a dodgy pickup line with spiritual consequences? Probably both, depending on who you asked and if they were trying to get out of the marriage afterward. A quirky tidbit related to this complexity: while the church emphasized consent, medieval society had some rather lax ideas about how that consent might be obtained or invalidated. For example, marrying someone who was already married, bigamy, was a definite no-no. But what if you married someone you thought was free, and it turned out they had a secret spouse? The validity of your marriage could be questioned. Or what about spiritual kinship? If you were godparents to the same child, or even if your parents were godparents together, it created a spiritual bond that could be an impediment to your marriage, potentially rendering it invalid. Imagine falling in love with the guy next door, only to find out your great-aunt Gertrude was his godfather's godmother's cousin twice removed, creating a complex web of spiritual no-go zones. The church's list of prohibited relationships, both by blood, marriage, and spirituality, was incredibly intricate and could easily trip people up, providing plenty of material for annulment cases. It was like a bureaucratic minefield for lovers. The mainstream historical fact here is that the church's increasing definition of marriage as a sacrament and its emphasis on the couple's consent, while seemingly progressive, existed in uneasy tension with the dominant social and economic function of marriage as an alliance between families. This conflict led to legal ambiguities, social friction, and provided fertile ground for those looking to bypass the formal system, sometimes for love, sometimes for less noble reasons. So while marriage was the approved channel, getting into a marriage was far from simple. It involved navigating not just the church's rules, but also family expectations, property concerns, social status, and potential legal pitfalls from spiritual impediments or messy betrothal contracts. For young people, the period between puberty and a potentially delayed arranged marriage was a significant chunk of their lives. It was a time of burgeoning desires, social interaction, often with limited supervision compared to modern standards, especially for lower classes mingling at markets, festivals, or simply working together. And the ever-present possibility of finding yourself drawn to someone outside the approved pathway. And if you gave in to those desires, hoping to maybe sneak in a clandestine vow later, or just praying confession would cover it, you were stepping into a complex landscape where the church's ideal met the grinding, unpredictable gears of social and economic reality. It was a high-stakes game of love, lust, property, and piety, often played without a clear rulebook, or at least without one everyone agreed on. And if you ended up with a surprise baby, well, that complicated everything even further, and often required a very hurried, potentially clandestine trip to the altar or hayloft. So you've wrapped your head around the fact that medieval marriage was a complicated beast, caught between sacred ideals, family strategy, and confusing legal loopholes like clandestine unions. Getting into that state of blessed, or perhaps just economically advantageous, matrimony wasn't always a single, swift step. Often it involved a precursor, the betrothal, or espousal. Think of it as the medieval engagement, but with legal teeth sharp enough to bite off a limb if you weren't careful. While marriage was the I take you now part, the betrothal was the I will take you in the future part. But don't let that future lull you into thinking it was just a casual promise. A betrothal, once properly made, was a serious, legally binding contract. It wasn't simply popping the question over a fancy dinner. Those didn't really exist in the same way anyway. And if they did, the food was probably weird. It was a formal declaration of intent to marry at a later date, often involving vows exchanged between the couple, sometimes in front of witnesses, occasionally blessed by a priest, and frequently sealed with the exchange of rings, gifts, or even a formal kiss. Imagine yourself standing there, maybe in a smoky tavern or a dusty village square, or perhaps even in the drafty hall of your family manor. There's your intended, perhaps someone you barely know, chosen by your parents or guardians. Your hand might be clasped in theirs, a symbolic gesture of union. You exchange words that sound something like, I, your name, promise to take you, intended's name, as my wife/husband at date/time, or within a reasonable time frame, and they respond in kind. Maybe a ring is placed on your finger, the forerunner of our modern engagement ring, signifying the bond. There might be a small feast afterward, or simply a handshake and a public declaration to neighbors or allies. This wasn't just social nicety, it was a contract enforceable by the church courts. If one party backed out without good reason, they could face legal penalties, including excommunication or being compelled to go through with the marriage. Good reasons for breaking a betrothal were limited. Discovering an unknown, significant impediment to marriage, like close kinship you weren't aware of, or perhaps one party becoming impotent or entering a religious order. Sorry, I just don't fancy you anymore, was not a valid excuse, even if their breath smelled perpetually of onions and their jokes never landed. You made a promise, and medieval promises, especially those involving property and alliances, stuck harder than mud on a peasant's boot. The period between betrothal and marriage could last months, even years, especially for noble families who needed time to negotiate dowries, prepare for lavish ceremonies, or wait for the bride and groom to reach a suitable age, though suitable by medieval standards was often quite young, puberty being the main benchmark. For peasants, it might be shorter, tied to the harvest cycle or the availability of resources. This interstitial phase, the betrothal limbo, is where things get really interesting and murky when you're talking about what medieval people did when they couldn't wait. The big throbbing question mark hanging over the betrothal period was this: was sex okay? After you were betrothed, but before you were married? The answer, depending on who you asked and when, ranged from absolutely not, that's fornication, to, well, you're basically married in God's eyes, so maybe you try out a day 60 then, it did your face. In the early Middle Ages, custom and even some interpretations of canon law must lean toward the idea that a betrothal, followed by sexual intercourse, effectively completed the marriage, even without the formal "I take you now" vows or a public ceremony. The logic was that the betrothal provided the consent, "I will take you," and the sexual act provided the consummation, which, as we touched on earlier, was seen by some as the physical seal on the spiritual bond. This was particularly true if the betrothal vows were exchanged per verba de futuro, in the future tense, and then followed by sex. Some jurists argued that the sex converted the future tense promise into a present tense reality. Imagine the potential for confusion and manipulation here. A couple exchanges betrothal vows privately. Maybe they genuinely love each other and see the betrothal as permission to engage in sexual relations, believing they are now essentially married in the eyes of God, if not yet in the eyes of the village priest or their parents. Or perhaps a man convinces a woman to exchange these vows, promising future marriage, and then pushes for sex, knowing that if she agrees, their union might be seen as valid by the church, potentially trapping her, or simply serving his immediate desires without him having to commit to a full public marriage anytime soon, if ever. Oh, don't worry, darling, we're betrothed. It's practically the same thing in the eyes of the church, especially if we, you know, seal the deal. Smooth, right? For the medieval cad, perhaps. For the young woman, potentially disastrous. As the church sought to bring more order and control to the process of marriage, particularly after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, the emphasis shifted more strongly toward the necessity of consent in the present tense and public solemnization, often involving the calling of banns and the presence of a priest. Clandestine marriages and the idea that betrothal, sex, automatically equaled marriage were increasingly discouraged, though they never entirely disappeared from practice or legal disputes. The official line hardened: sex during betrothal, while perhaps viewed slightly more leniently than sex between two completely unattached people, was still technically fornication, a sin. You were committed to marrying, yes, but you weren't actually married yet in the fullest sense. However, popular custom is a stubborn mule, and it often lagged behind or outright ignored church doctrine. In many communities, especially in rural areas, betrothal was seen as a green light, or at least a yellow light, for sexual activity. The couple was publicly committed, their families had agreed usually, and the wedding was coming. What was the harm in getting an early start? This period could be one of relative freedom compared to the strictures before betrothal or the full responsibilities after marriage. You were sort of in a liminal space, halfway across the bridge but not quite on the other side. And hey, if a pregnancy resulted from this betrothal period intimacy, it could usually be legitimized relatively easily by simply proceeding with the planned marriage. A baby born within espousals might raise fewer eyebrows than one born completely out of wedlock. This complex legal and social landscape surrounding the betrothal is a significant point of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether sex during betrothal was widely accepted custom, a contested practice the church struggled to suppress, or primarily a tool for seduction and manipulation. Some argue that for peasant communities, where betrothal often coincided with setting up a household, sexual activity was a natural part of beginning their life together, albeit ahead of the official church blessing. Others emphasize the church's consistent, if sometimes inconsistently enforced, condemnation of premarital sex, even within betrothal, highlighting the tension between pious ideals and practical realities. Was it a period of relative sexual liberation for the medieval young person, or just another arena for potential exploitation under the guise of a future commitment? A mainstream historical fact here is that medieval betrothal was a legally binding contract, distinct from, but intended to lead to marriage. This contract required specific forms of consent, future tense vows, and could only be broken under strict legal grounds, giving it far more weight than a modern engagement. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to betrothal customs. In some regions, the exchange of betrothal vows might be accompanied by highly symbolic acts, like the couple drinking from the same cup, or the groom-to-be presenting the bride with a piece of his clothing or armor, or even a symbolic payment to the bride or her family, essentially a down payment on the future union. These weren't just romantic gestures, they were reinforcing the contractual nature of the agreement in ways the community understood. Imagine being handed a rusty gauntlet as a sign of eternal love. Less diamond ring, more slightly smelly metal glove. Classy. The binding nature of betrothal also meant it could be used to prevent someone from being forced into an undesirable marriage. If you were betrothed to someone, even clandestinely, your family couldn't legally force you to marry someone else, as you were already contracted. This offered a potential, though risky, avenue for individuals, particularly women, to exercise some agency in their marital fate, using a prior betrothal as a shield against a more powerful, unwanted match. Of course, your family might just beat you up or lock you away, but legally they were on shakier ground, forcing a second betrothal or marriage if the first one could be proven. So you see how this betrothal period becomes a hotbed of potential activity, both sanctioned and otherwise. It's a time of transition, of anticipation, and for some, of taking the next step before the official ceremony. The legal framework was complex and evolving, the social customs varied, and the church's stance was clear in doctrine, but often blurred in practice. It offered a window, a perhaps unintended consequence of delaying the formal wedding, during which young people navigated their burgeoning desires and the confusing expectations placed upon them. Whether it was planned intimacy born of a recognized commitment or opportunistic encounters taking advantage of the ambiguity, the betrothal period was certainly a time when the lines between waiting and not waiting became particularly fuzzy for medieval folks. And navigating those fuzzy lines could have lifelong consequences for your social standing, your eternal soul, and perhaps most immediately, if a telltale baby bump started to show before the priest said his final blessings. So you've waded through the complexities of formal marriage, the minefield of betrothal, and the various ways people promise themselves to one another, sometimes testing the boundaries of those promises before the final knot was tied. But what if the formal route, even the betrothal stage, was simply out of reach, too slow, too expensive, or actively opposed by watchful parents or guardians? What if you couldn't even pretend to wait for a betrothal? Well, the medieval landscape offered another path, one shrouded in shadow and legal ambiguity, but surprisingly potent: the clandestine marriage. Forget banns read in church for 3 weeks. Forget priests in their vestments, witnesses gathered, or families exchanging dowries and deeds. A clandestine marriage was, at its simplest, just you and another person exchanging consent to be married right now to each other in the present tense. The magic words were key. Instead of the betrothals, "I will take you as my wife/husband," you said, "I take you as my wife/husband." And they replied in kind. Per verba de presenti, words of the present. According to early canon law, that was often enough. Consent, freely given by two legally capable individuals, was considered the essential ingredient for marriage. Everything else, the ceremony, the witnesses, the blessings, the feasts, was just icing on the wedding cake, or perhaps, given the lack of actual cake at most medieval events, just extra gravy on the peas. Imagine the scene. You sneak away from your family's watchful eyes. Perhaps you meet your beloved in a quiet corner of the marketplace at dusk, behind the local alehouse, or under a specific oak tree known only to you both. There might be a single trusted friend or two acting as witnesses, or perhaps no one else at all. The air is thick with secrecy, maybe a little fear, and the nervous flutter of illicit excitement. You look into their eyes, perhaps holding hands, and whisper or firmly state those few crucial words. I take you for my husband, wife. They echo the sentiment. And just like that, in the eyes of many legal minds, and crucially, in the eyes of the church, according to its older doctrines, you were married. No rings necessarily exchanged, no documents signed, paper was precious. No one else's permission sought, just a mutual, present-tense declaration of intent. Why would anyone choose this risky, secretive path? The reasons were manifold and often desperate. Perhaps your family was pushing you into a marriage with someone you despised. Someone old, cruel, or politically inconvenient. A clandestine marriage, even a secret one, could provide a legal shield. If you could prove you were already married, your family couldn't legally force you into another union. You were already taken, even if no one knew it yet. It was a form of radical, albeit dangerous personal agency in a world where individual desires often took a back seat to family strategy and economic gain. Or maybe it was a matter of urgency. Perhaps intimacy had already occurred, that not waiting thing we're focusing on, you see, and a pregnancy was suspected or obvious. A quick, secret marriage could legitimize the child and save the couple from potentially severe social consequences, including shaming, penance, or expulsion from the community. Getting married, even secretly, was almost always preferable to having a child born completely out of wedlock, the bastard stain being incredibly difficult to wash off in medieval society. A quick clandestine marriage could sometimes reclassify the child from born of fornication to born within a valid, though irregular, marriage. A quick fix for a potentially lifelong problem. Cost was another factor. Formal marriages, especially for the middling sort or gentry, could be expensive. Feasts to host, gifts to exchange, sometimes fees for priests or notaries. A clandestine marriage cost nothing but the nerve to carry it out. For poorer folks, or those simply wanting to save their meager resources, it offered a way to formalize their partnership without financial burden. Imagine scraping by, maybe wanting to start a small household, but unable to afford the social performance of a typical wedding. A few whispered words could make you man and wife, allowing you to proceed with building a life together, even if discreetly at first. And yes, sometimes it was simply seduction. A smooth-talking individual might convince someone, often a young woman, to exchange these vows in private, perhaps promising to reveal the marriage later. Once the vows were exchanged, and particularly if followed by sexual intercourse, the union might be considered valid in the eyes of the law. This could leave the less savvy party legally bound but socially isolated, with no public proof of their marital status and vulnerable to abandonment. Oh, darling, we don't need all that fuss and bother. We'll just say the words to each other now. Just you and me. It's our special secret. It's just as real as any marriage. Yeah, maybe legally real, but practically a nightmare if they rode off into the sunset without you. It was a medieval version of being told, we don't need a title for this, it's serious. Except the title was actually legally binding. The church's stance on clandestine marriage evolved significantly over the Middle Ages. Initially influenced by Roman law and early Christian thought which emphasized consent, these simple private unions were often recognized as valid marriages, however irregular. The key was that free consent had been given in the present tense. However, this created chaos. How could you prove you were married? How could families track alliances? How could the church regulate morality and collect fees if unions happened in secret? It led to endless disputes over inheritance, legitimacy, and whether someone was free to marry again. Imagine the mess, but sire, he claims he's already married to Agnes the milkmaid. They said words to each other behind the pigsty 3 years ago. Agnes has no proof, but she says they did. Try resolving that in court. Over time, the Church, particularly through reforming councils like the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 and later synods, pushed harder and harder against clandestine marriages. They didn't necessarily declare them invalid right away. That would be complex, potentially bastardizing countless children and dissolving established unions. But they declared them illicit, forbidden, sinful, but still legally binding, and introduced measures to prevent them. The requirement for public bans, announcements of the intent to marry, read in the parish church on 3 successive Sundays or feast days, became standard. The presence of a priest and witnesses was increasingly emphasized as necessary for a licit, legal, and proper marriage, even if not strictly required for validity in all cases initially. This creates a fascinating legal tightrope. A clandestine marriage might be valid in God's eyes and potentially legally binding in a church court if proven, but it lacked the social recognition, the blessing of the community, and the public record that a formal marriage provided. It was a marriage, but one that existed in a kind of legal and social gray zone. You were married, but your neighbors might not believe it, your family might deny it, and proving it years later if one party reneged could be incredibly difficult. Historians still argue whether clandestine marriages were relatively rare acts of desperation or resistance, or if they were a widespread phenomenon, perhaps even common practice among certain segments of the population, like the poor or those living far from parish centers, who simply formalized their unions quickly and privately without the elaborate public performance the church increasingly preferred. Some scholars point to the sheer volume of court cases dealing with disputed marriages as evidence of how common these informal unions were. Others argue that the disputes arose precisely because these unions were irregular and hard to prove, suggesting they weren't the norm, but rather exceptions that caused trouble. It's a chicken and egg problem wrapped in a medieval shroud of secrecy. Were they common, hence causing many disputes? Or did the nature of their secrecy make the few that happened disproportionately litigious? A mainstream historical fact here is that the requirement for public bans in the presence of a priest for illicit marriage was a direct response by the medieval church to try and suppress clandestine unions and bring the process of marriage under greater institutional control and transparency. This wasn't just about religious formality, it was about legal clarity and social order. They wanted marriage to be a public, verifiable event, not a whispered promise in a field. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to clandestine marriages in the attempt to prove them. Because there was often no priest, no church record, and few or no reliable witnesses, proving a clandestine marriage in court could rely on all sorts of circumstantial evidence. This could include proof of cohabitation as husband and wife, even if only for a short time, public reputation, did neighbors believe they were married, exchange of gifts following the alleged vows, acting as if married, or even sometimes proof of sexual relations after the vows were allegedly exchanged, as this might be taken as evidence that the couple considered themselves married and were consummating the union. Imagine trying to round up your neighbors to testify about whether they saw you and your alleged spouse sharing a bed or holding hands like a married couple. A truly awkward discovery process. So, Master Giles, you say you saw them exiting the same barn at dawn. Did they appear spouse-like? The potential for abuse in this system is clear. A man could persuade a woman to exchange vows privately, promising later solemnization, engage in sexual relations, which some might interpret as further solidifying the union, and then simply deny the whole thing ever happened if she became pregnant or inconvenient. Without witnesses or proof, she had little recourse and would be left with an illegitimate child and a ruined reputation. This was another sharp edge of the not waiting problem. If you formalized your union quickly and secretly to enable intimacy, you ran the immense risk that the formalization might be impossible to prove later if things went sour. So, the clandestine marriage was a high-stakes gamble. It offered a way around the cumbersome, expensive, or restrictive traditional routes to marriage. It could be a tool of liberation for those escaping unwanted matches, or a desperate attempt to legitimize a relationship and potential offspring. But it was also a breeding ground for deceit, abandonment, and endless legal wrangling. It existed in that blurry space where personal consent clashed with the church's desire for public order and control, and where the urgent desire to not wait could lead people into unions that were legally valid in theory, but incredibly fragile and fraught with peril in practice. It was a testament to the fact that medieval people, just like us, found ways to forge their own paths, even if those paths led through the shadows and required navigating a complex, often unforgiving landscape of law, custom, and religious doctrine. So you see how tricky even the concept of being married could be. Was it the words you said now, or the words you said about the future, or the public ceremony later, or maybe even just living together? It was a legal and social minefield, and into this complicated landscape steps the inevitable reality of human nature, something that tends not to wait patiently for legal complexities or priestly blessings: physical intimacy. You've gone through the dance of finding someone, maybe agreeing to marry, perhaps even going through the formal, semi-binding process of betrothal. There's an understanding, a commitment, maybe even a public declaration that you will be married. But the final step, the full church ceremony, the feast, the official joining of households, that could be weeks, months, or even years away, especially if families were negotiating dowry, arranging property transfers, or waiting for the couple to reach a suitable age or financial standing. What happens in the meantime? What happens when desire meets opportunity within the gray area of a committed but not yet fully solemnized relationship? This period after betrothal but before the wedding was particularly ripe ground for the not waiting scenario. Remember, betrothal, sponsalia, especially sponsalia per verba de futuro, was a serious commitment. It was a promise of future marriage, often exchanged with witnesses, maybe even involving an earnest penny or gift. You were, in many ways, already considered spoken for, no longer available on the matrimonial market. You were fiancé isem, not just random single folks. In some communities, this stage granted couples certain liberties they wouldn't have had before the promise was made. There might be more freedom to spend time together, to court openly within limits. Of course, chaperones were often still a thing, though maybe slightly less hawk-eyed than before, and to grow closer. And as proximity and affection grew within the context of a recognized, albeit future commitment, the lines between what was permissible and what was officially forbidden could blur considerably. The church's official teaching was clear, unwavering, and frankly, a bit inconvenient for many medieval couples. Any sexual intercourse outside the bounds of a valid, completed marriage was a sin. Period. Full stop. It was fornication if you were both unmarried, adultery if one or both were married to someone else, and other specific sins for other permutations. The sanctity of the marriage bed was paramount, and that marriage bed was only officially sanctioned after the rings were exchanged, the blessings given, and the knot well and truly tied in the eyes of the church and the community. But here's where practice often diverged from preaching, particularly in that betrothal phase. Think about it. You've made this formal promise. Your families know, maybe the whole village knows. You're saving up for the feast, perhaps building a cottage. Maybe one of you has even moved closer to the other's family. There's a powerful sense of inevitability about the marriage. It is going to happen. So does it really matter if you anticipate the marital rites a little early? For many medieval people, steeped in a culture that often viewed sex primarily within the context of procreation and marriage, the jump from "we are definitely getting married" to "we are effectively married and might as well act like it" wasn't as enormous a leap as the church doctrine might suggest, especially since in many legal traditions, the marriage became indissoluble after consummation. So if you were absolutely certain this was the person you wanted to spend your life with, and you'd already committed to them, anticipating the consummation could even be seen by some as a way to further solidify the bond, to make the promise of future marriage into a present reality. This is where that tangled legal aspect from clandestine marriage pops up again. Remember proverba de presenti, words of the present, and proverba de futuro, words of the future? The church courts grappled constantly with how sex interacted with these promises. If a couple exchanged sponsalia per verba de futuro, I will take you, and later had sex, some legal interpretations, particularly influenced by Roman law concepts, held that this act of intercourse transformed the future promise into a present marriage. Matrimonium radum, or sometimes per verba de presenti, confirmed by subsequent copulation. It was seen as the couple implicitly agreeing to be married, now through their physical union within the context of their existing commitment. This was a nightmare for the church hierarchy trying to enforce uniform rules and bring marriage fully under clerical control. It meant unions could be created and validated outside of church walls, without a priest, simply by a promise and subsequent sex. Imagine the confusion and potential for dispute. You are betrothed to Agnes. You've promised to marry her next year. You spend time together, affection grows, and eventually, intimacy occurs. In your mind, or perhaps the community's mind, maybe you're married now. But your parents, who are still negotiating the dowry, might vehemently disagree. And Agnes's family, if they decide they can get a better match for her, might try to argue that the promise was broken and the sex was mere fornication, not a conversion to valid marriage. This is where it could get very messy, very quickly. Church courts saw a constant stream of cases where couples, families, or abandoned individuals argued whether sex after a promise constituted a binding marriage or not. It was like medieval reality TV, but with higher stakes and way worse dental hygiene. Did you or did you not consummate the betrothal behind the miller's shed? The court demands to know. The church worked hard to stamp out this idea that sex could validate a future promise into a present marriage outside of the required ceremony. They increasingly emphasized that while consent was necessary for a valid marriage, public solemnization by a priest was required for illicit marriage, the only kind they fully approved of and recognized for record-keeping and social order. By the time of the Council of Trent in the 16th century, a bit late for our core medieval period, but showing the culmination of medieval trends, the church definitively ruled that a marriage was only valid if performed in the presence of a priest and witnesses, effectively shutting down the legal loophole of clandestine consent or conversion via intercourse after betrothal. But throughout much of the Middle Ages, that loophole, or at least the popular belief in its existence, persisted. So premarital sex, particularly post-betrothal sex, wasn't always viewed with the same level of scandal or sinfulness as simple fornication between two people with no commitment whatsoever. While officially a sin, it existed in a sort of moral and legal twilight zone. It was wrong, yes, you'd have to confess it, probably do penance, but it might not carry the same crushing social stigma as producing a child completely outside of any recognized relationship structure. It was sin within a framework of commitment, which was, in the eyes of many, slightly less egregious than sin without any framework. It's like stealing a cookie from the cupcake you've already been promised you'll get later versus stealing a cookie from a random bakery window. Still stealing, but one feels slightly less anarchic. Beyond the legal and moral gray areas, there were practical reasons for not waiting. In some regions, especially in Northern Europe, there was a custom known as hand fasting, which could sometimes be a temporary year-and-a-day binding betrothal, after which the couple either fully married or went their separate ways, though this practice varied greatly. Within such customs, a period of cohabitation and even intimacy might have been more socially accepted as part of the betrothal process, provided the intention was to proceed to full marriage or a recognized dissolution. This wasn't necessarily the norm everywhere, and the church generally disapproved of practices that looked too much like trial marriages, but it highlights the regional variations in how these stages were handled. For some couples, intimacy before the wedding was simply a result of the pressures of medieval life. If a couple was betrothed and one was moving to join the other's household, they might begin cohabiting out of necessity before the formal ceremony could be arranged. Living together as husband and wife, even without the final blessing, often naturally led to physical intimacy. In these cases, the community might tacitly accept the situation, seeing them as effectively married, even if the priest hadn't performed the final rite yet. It was less about rebellion or explicit sinfulness, and more about the practicalities of starting a life together when the formal process dragged on. Moreover, there was sometimes a strong, though perhaps unspoken, pressure for couples to prove fertility before the final knot was tied, especially if the marriage was primarily about producing heirs. While hard evidence of widespread trial periods is scarce and debated, the intense focus on lineage and inheritance meant that a barren marriage could be a significant disaster. Producing a child, even before the full wedding, could sometimes solidify the commitment and reassure families that the union would fulfill its primary purpose. This is a darker side of the not waiting. It could be less about romantic passion and more about performing biological duty on demand. Imagine the stress. Right, darling, we're betrothed. Let's ensure our family's futures, shall we? No pressure, but maybe bring a rabbit's foot. A mainstream historical fact is that the medieval church consistently condemned fornication, sex outside of marriage, as a mortal sin requiring confession and penance for salvation. This was a core part of their moral teaching and was preached from pulpits across Europe. While the application of this doctrine to the betrothed was messy and debated, the general rule was absolute: no sex before the final I do in church. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some penitential manuals, guides for priests hearing confession, treated post-betrothal fornication differently than simple fornication, sometimes prescribing slightly lighter penances, acknowledging the existing commitment. This suggests a de facto recognition, even within the church's disciplinary system, that not all instances of premarital sex were viewed equally, despite the official blanket condemnation. It implies a grudging acknowledgement of the complexities of human relationships in the lengthy marriage process. You still sinned, sure, but maybe the penance was fasting on Fridays for a year instead of, say, a pilgrimage to Rome on your knees. Small mercies. Historians still argue whether not waiting after betrothal was a relatively common occurrence, perhaps even informally accepted in some social strata or regions, or if it remained a relatively rare transgression, primarily driven by desperate circumstances like pregnancy or genuine scandal. Evidence comes largely from court records, disputes over marriage validity, and penitential manuals, how sins were confessed and disciplined, both of which highlight problems rather than everyday compliant behavior. Did most betrothed couples patiently wait, or were the records we have just the tip of an iceberg of widespread pre-wedding intimacy? It's tough to know for sure, adding another layer to the mystery of medieval bedrooms, or barns, or haystacks. Ultimately, the period between betrothal and marriage was a tense balancing act. You were committed but not fully joined. Society expected you to eventually become husband and wife, but the path there could be long and fraught. Desire, practicality, pressure, and even legal ambiguity all converged to create a situation where not waiting for the final ceremony was a tempting, sometimes necessary, and often legally confusing choice. It was a gamble against strict religious doctrine, played out in the private lives of medieval people navigating the complex journey towards partnership. You've navigated the choppy waters of betrothal, the promise made, the commitment given, hovering in that space between spoken vows and solemnized union. And as we discussed, that waiting period, well, it didn't always involve just waiting. Now take that scenario, layer on top the messy, unpredictable reality of human biology, and you arrive at one of the single biggest drivers for accelerating a medieval marriage: an unplanned, or perhaps earlier than planned, pregnancy. Suddenly, the leisurely pace of negotiating dowry, arranging the feast, waiting for the harvest to come in, or simply letting the couple reach a more mature age, slams headfirst into a 9-month deadline. In medieval society, the arrival of a child outside of a fully recognized, valid marriage was a social, legal, and spiritual catastrophe. Illegitimacy carried a heavy stigma. An illegitimate child might be barred from inheriting property, especially noble titles or land tied to lineage. Their social standing was compromised from birth. From the church's perspective, a child born outside marriage was, by definition, a product of sin, fornication, or adultery. While the child themselves wasn't inherently sinful, their origins were tainted, and this could affect everything from their opportunities in life to their very soul in the eyes of the most devout. Think of it as a giant scarlet letter, not just for the mother, but for the child and their entire family, potentially for generations. So, if you were a young woman, perhaps betrothed, perhaps just strongly considering marriage to a young man, and you found yourself pregnant, the waiting game was abruptly, terrifyingly over. The priority shifted from planning a wedding someday to getting married now. The pressure came from everywhere. Your parents would be mortified, facing shame and potentially economic repercussions if your reputation was ruined. The man's family might initially resist. Why marry someone who brought shame upon their house? But usually the pressure to legitimize the child and avoid the deep dishonor of illegitimacy pushed families towards action. For the couple themselves, fear was a powerful motivator. For the woman, the prospect of facing childbirth and raising a child alone, with no husband to provide for her or give the child a legitimate name, was terrifying. She faced ostracism, poverty, and perpetual shame. For the man, while the social consequences weren't always as immediately devastating as for the woman, he still faced pressure from his family and the community, not to mention potential legal action to force him to support the child. If they were already betrothed, the path was usually clear, though still fraught with urgency. If they weren't formally committed, the pregnancy could force the issue of marriage in a way that simple courtship never could. Imagine the scene. You're sitting with your parents, the air thick with tension. Your mother is probably weeping. Your father is red-faced with anger or slumped in despair. You've just confessed the inescapable truth. The man you've been seeing, maybe even promising yourselves to one another in secret, is the father. Now, the focus isn't on the beauty of a wedding dress or the size of the dowry chest, but on crisis management. He must marry you, your father insists, his voice shaking. The betrothal, if one existed, suddenly transitions from a future plan to a binding contract needing immediate fulfillment. If no formal betrothal had taken place, negotiations that might have taken months were compressed into frantic days. The question wasn't, should they marry? But how quickly can we get this done? This situation also interacted complexly with those medieval marriage laws we touched on. Remember how some argued that sex after a sponsalia per verba de futuro, a promise of future marriage, could convert it into a sponsalia per verba de presenti, a present marriage. A pregnancy could strengthen this argument considerably. If a couple promised to marry in the future, had sex, and the woman became pregnant, it was much harder for the man to later deny the validity of the marriage or abandon the woman. The pregnancy served as undeniable physical evidence of the relationship and often solidified the legal claim that a marriage, valid in the eyes of some canon lawyers, had indeed occurred through the combination of promise and consummation. Church courts often look favorably upon the woman's claim in such cases, seeking to ensure the child's legitimacy if possible, even if it meant validating a union that hadn't followed the preferred solemnization procedures. However, this wasn't always a smooth process. The man might deny paternity, although in small medieval communities, paternity was often pretty obvious if the couple had been seen together frequently. His family might fight the marriage, especially if the woman was of lower social standing or brought no dowry. The woman's family might be desperate but have little leverage if the man was from a more powerful family. It was a prime scenario for legal battles, family feuds, and heartbreaking abandonment. In some extreme cases, if marriage was absolutely impossible, perhaps the man was already married or refused point blank and couldn't be compelled. The consequences for the woman and child were dire. She might be driven out of her home, forced to rely on charity, or even turned to prostitution to survive. The child would be raised as a child of no one, with limited rights in a difficult path in life. Communities could be harsh on unmarried mothers, viewing them as public sinners. While there were systems of charity and support, they were often inadequate and tinged with judgment. The urgency created by pregnancy meant that many of the customary steps of marriage preparation were rushed or skipped entirely. The elaborate wedding feast might be scaled down or canceled. The public bans, announcements in church to check for impediments, might be hurried through. The focus was solely on getting the couple before a priest to exchange vows and receive the blessing, making the union official before the baby arrived. This shotgun wedding scenario, familiar from later periods, was very much a reality in the Middle Ages, driven by the intense societal need to avoid the stain of illegitimacy. Consider the emotional toll. A pregnancy is a huge life event, usually accompanied by excitement, nervousness, and preparation. Now imagine all that amplified by panic, shame, and the frantic rush to get married under duress. There wasn't much time for romantic contemplation or leisurely nesting. It was a race against the calendar, with the impending birth date looming like a final exam you absolutely had to pass. This pressure cooker environment could lead to unhappy marriages, forced unions between people who might not have otherwise chosen each other, or who were too young to properly handle the responsibilities of marriage and parenthood. But in the eyes of medieval society, even an unhappy, rushed marriage was infinitely preferable to an illegitimate child. The institution of marriage, with its power to legitimize offspring and maintain social order and inheritance lines, was the ultimate goal, and pregnancy was a very effective, if stressful, shortcut. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is the strong legal and social discrimination against illegitimate children throughout the medieval period. They often had few or no inheritance rights, especially to land, and their status significantly limited their opportunities, a status that could only be retroactively changed if their parents subsequently married. This created enormous pressure to legitimize a child if at all possible. A quirky or fringe tidbit comes from medieval folklore and superstition. There were various folk remedies and beliefs associated with trying to avoid pregnancy outside of marriage, ranging from carrying certain amulets to ingesting questionable concoctions. More darkly, there were also folk beliefs and practices related to abortion, which were extremely dangerous and, of course, condemned by the church. The desperation to avoid the consequences of an unplanned pregnancy drove some to these perilous extremes. Imagine trying to figure out if a certain herb found in the woods, combined with saying a prayer backward, might just save you from social ruin. Definitely not in the medical textbooks. Historians still argue whether the rates of premarital pregnancy leading to hurried marriages were relatively consistent across different social classes, or if the pressures and outcomes varied significantly. While noble families faced intense pressure due to inheritance, lower classes also faced severe economic hardship and social stigma. Records are patchy, and interpreting the frequency of shotgun weddings based on surviving court documents or parish records, which often started later in the medieval period, is challenging, leaving the true prevalence open to scholarly debate. The consequence of a pregnancy was so profound that it changed everything. It turned clandestine encounters or quiet promises into urgent public problems demanding immediate resolution. It highlighted the precarious position of women whose reputations and futures could be irrevocably damaged by a pregnancy outside marriage. And it underscored the powerful, if sometimes brutal, function of medieval marriage as the essential legal and social framework for procreation and family life. The desire to not wait could be born of affection, impatience, or opportunity, but if it resulted in a child, the game changed entirely. It was no longer about desire versus doctrine, but about survival, legitimacy, and navigating a sudden, non-negotiable transition into adulthood and parenthood, usually far faster than planned. That quiet moment of intimacy, perhaps after betrothal, could suddenly echo with the sound of tiny, very real, and potentially illegitimate footsteps getting closer. So you've seen how tangled things could get on the ground. How biology, family pressure, and the sheer awkwardness of an unexpected bun in the oven could scramble all the rules about waiting. But sitting above all this, watching, judging, and ultimately shaping much of the moral landscape was the church. The medieval church wasn't just a place you went on Sunday to hear a sermon you probably couldn't understand because it was in Latin. It was the bedrock of society, a pervasive influence touching every aspect of life, including, perhaps especially, your private life. And when it came to sex outside of marriage, the church had opinions. Very strong, very consistent, and often quite terrifying opinions. Their fundamental teaching was clear and unwavering. Sex was only legitimate within the bonds of a valid marriage, and even then its primary purpose was procreation. Any other sexual activity, outside marriage, for pleasure alone or using certain prohibited positions or methods, was considered sinful. Simple fornication, sex between unmarried individuals, was a sin. Adultery, sex with someone you weren't married to, when one or both of you was married to someone else, was a far graver sin, a violation of both the marital bond and God's law. Other acts like masturbation or homosexuality were considered even worse deviations, attracting harsher condemnation and penances. The scale of sinfulness was meticulously mapped out, often in dizzying detail. This wasn't just abstract theology, it had practical implications for your everyday existence and, crucially, for your eternal soul. In medieval Christian belief, unconfessed mortal sin condemned you to hell, and sexual sins, particularly those outside marriage, were definitely on the mortal list. This belief was a powerful, pervasive force, a constant whisper in the back of your mind. You might be tempted, you might give in, but you knew, with absolute certainty ingrained since childhood, that you were risking damnation. This fear was perhaps the single greatest deterrent against not waiting that the church possessed. Forget social shame for a moment. That was bad enough. But fiery, eternal torment? That tended to focus the mind. The primary mechanism through which the church interacted with your private moral struggles was confession. By the later Middle Ages, annual confession was mandatory for all adult Christians. You had to confess your sins to a priest and receive absolution. Imagine walking into a dimly lit church, perhaps cold and smelling of old stone and incense, and kneeling before a priest, probably someone you knew from the village or town, who was now acting as the intermediary between you and the Almighty. This wasn't like having a casual chat with a therapist. This felt like standing at the gates of judgment. Confessors were trained, though training quality varied immensely. They often used manuals called penitentials to guide them. These books were fascinating, sometimes alarming, and incredibly detailed catalogs of sins and the appropriate penances. A good confessor wasn't just a passive listener. They were expected to probe. They had to ask questions to uncover sins the penitent might be too ashamed to mention or might not even recognize as sins. And yes, these questions absolutely extended to your sexual life. A confessor might ask if you had engaged in fornication, with whom, how many times, even how. Though direct questions about specific acts were sometimes debated, the general principle was to uncover the full extent of the sin. It was effectively a mandatory annual audit of your soul, with a particular focus on the sticky areas like sex, theft, and violating church laws. Think about the power dynamic. You, a layperson, kneeling, perhaps trembling slightly, having to reveal your most private transgressions to a man who, in that moment, held the keys to your spiritual fate. The priest could grant or withhold absolution based on your apparent contrition and willingness to perform the assigned penance. The penances could range from saying a certain number of prayers, fasting on specific days, giving alms to the poor, or even undertaking a pilgrimage, depending on the severity of the sin and the confessor's judgment. For serious sexual sins, especially if they were habitual or involved multiple partners, the penance could be quite severe and prolonged. Having a bit of fun with someone you liked might suddenly mean months of restrictive fasting or endless cycles of Hail Marys. Not exactly a lightweight consequence. This system created a constant cycle of sin, guilt, confession, penance, and absolution. For those who struggled with the church's strict sexual rules, which, let's be honest, was probably a fair chunk of the population, because humans gonna human, confession was both a source of immense pressure and the only path to spiritual relief. You had to confess it eventually or risk hell. So the anticipation of that difficult conversation, the shame of admitting your actions, and the burden of the resulting penance acted as a very real brake on behavior for devout individuals. It wasn't just about getting caught by people, it was about getting caught by God and telling his representative all about it. Kind of takes the spontaneity out of things, doesn't it? Hey, you want to sneak off to the barn later? Ooh, tempting. But the penance for barn-based activities is 3 weeks on bread and water. And frankly, I'm just not feeling that committed right now. A mainstream historical fact here is the universal and mandatory nature of confession in the medieval Catholic Church after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. This decree solidified the confessional as a central pillar of Christian life, ensuring that the Church had a regular, formalized channel through which to police the morals of the populace, including their sexual conduct. It wasn't just voluntary, it was required for salvation. Now, for a quirky or fringe tidbit, those penitential manuals I mentioned could get really truly specific and sometimes veer into territory that makes you wonder exactly what kind of conversations were happening back then or what sins the monks writing these books were anticipating. They didn't just list fornication. Oh no, they would list specific types of fornication based on the relationship between the people, the location, or even the actions involved. Some sections read less like spiritual guidance and more like a rather dry instructional catalog of prohibited acts, complete with varying levels of penance. One famous example, though debated in terms of its actual widespread use, is the Irish Penitential of Cummian, which assigned penances for everything from kissing with desire to various sexual positions, sometimes referencing acts that seem incredibly niche or frankly physically improbable, leaving you wondering if the priests were dealing with actual confessions or just letting their imaginations run wild in the scriptorium. It's a bit like reading a medieval sin menu. Ah yes, I'll have the basic fornication with a side of heavy petting. Please, what's the penance for that again? Beyond the confessional box, the Church's moral framework saturated society through sermons, religious art, which often depicted the gruesome fates of sinners, and the very fabric of community life. Your neighbors, your family, they all understood the Church's teachings, and their judgment was often a reflection of that. If you were known to be living in sin, it wasn't just a private matter. It was a public scandal, a bad example that the church hierarchy and local community leaders felt compelled to address. Despite this immense pressure, people of course still engaged in premarital sex. The power of desire, affection, social opportunity, like those betrothal periods we talked about, and simply human nature didn't magically disappear because the church said so. The system wasn't necessarily about achieving total compliance, it was about creating a framework of guilt, repentance, and control. It meant that if you did engage in forbidden behavior, you were likely burdened by guilt, potentially ostracized if found out, and definitely facing a potentially awkward and demanding session in the confessional. The church's influence didn't eliminate the behavior, but it absolutely shaped the experience of it, making it fraught with spiritual peril. It also influenced how families and communities reacted to situations like the unplanned pregnancies we just discussed. The urgency to marry in the face of pregnancy was driven not just by social reputation and inheritance, but by the deep-seated need to avoid the sin of having an illegitimate child and to live within the bounds of church-approved marriage. Marrying even hastily legitimized the child in the eyes of both society and, crucially, the church, potentially turning a state of sin into a state of grace, for the marriage itself anyway. This dual pressure, fear of eternal damnation for the sin of fornication and adultery, and the need to confess and perform penance, was a constant factor in medieval life. It meant that not waiting wasn't just a personal choice about desire, it was a spiritual gamble with cosmic consequences. You might weigh the momentary pleasure against the potential for eternal suffering and the certainty of a difficult confession and unpleasant penance. For some, the fear was overwhelming. For others, well, human ingenuity, or perhaps foolishness, depending on your perspective, often finds ways around strict rules or at least finds ways to manage the consequences. Maybe you plan to confess later. Maybe you hope the priest wouldn't ask too many questions. Maybe you rationalize your actions somehow. Historians still argue whether the constant threat of hell and the mandatory confessional system actually reduced the overall incidence of sexual activity outside marriage, or if it merely changed the way people thought about it, felt guilty about it, and confessed it? Did it suppress the behavior, or did it just create a massive, ongoing spiritual accounting system for widespread sin? It's hard to measure something like private sexual activity from 700 years ago. We have the rules the church laid down. We have the confessionals where people were supposed to unload their sins. And we have penitential manuals listing those sins in agonizing detail. But the actual gap between the ideal Christian life and the messy reality of human desire remains a topic of ongoing scholarly debate. We know the church tried very hard to police behavior and thought, particularly regarding sex, but we don't have reliable statistics on just how successful they were at preventing people from, doing the deed before the ring was on the finger. It's a bit like asking if speed limits prevent speeding or just mean people try not to get caught. So the church's teachings in the practice of confession cast a long, often heavy shadow over the question of waiting. It wasn't just a matter of social norms or family expectations. It was a matter of your soul's salvation. Every act outside of sanctioned marriage carried the weight of potential sin, requiring repentance and penance. It added a layer of spiritual drama and consequence to choices that might seem purely personal today. And for those medieval souls struggling with temptation or dealing with the aftermath of giving in, the path inevitably led, often with trepidation, to that quiet corner of the church, ready to face the priest and through him, the difficult reckoning with their conscience and their God. Waiting suddenly seemed like a much safer, if less immediately satisfying option when faced with the alternative being listed in a penitential under acts leading directly to purgatory, possibly worse. So you've grappled with the intense spiritual consequences laid out by the church, the gnawing guilt, the mandatory confession, the potentially hefty penance, and the ever-present threat of eternal damnation. That was a powerful force shaping your inner life and your potential afterlife. But the church wasn't the only entity keeping an eye on your behavior, and religious morality wasn't the only consequence you had to worry about if you decided not to wait. There was also the very real, very earthly power of secular law and the authority of lords, kings, and town officials. Getting caught by them meant different kinds of trouble, potentially more immediate, intangible than an eternity in hell, though perhaps less existentially terrifying. Medieval secular law, that is the law of the land enforced by temporal rulers rather than religious ones, was a complex patchwork. It wasn't like today with a single Tongyi national legal code. Instead, you had royal law, if your king was strong enough to enforce it widely, regional customary laws that had been passed down through generations, and local ordinances enacted by lords of manors or town councils. This meant that the exact legal ramifications of getting caught not waiting could vary wildly depending on where you lived, who your lord was, and even what year it was, as laws and customs could change. But generally speaking, secular law also took a dim view of sexual activity outside of sanctioned marriage, though often for slightly different reasons than the church. While the church focused on the sin against God and the state of your soul, secular authorities were more concerned with maintaining social order, protecting property rights, including the property aspect that men sometimes saw in their wives or the sexual fidelity of their betrothed, preventing public scandal that could disrupt the peace, and sometimes, let's be honest, just extracting fines. Money talks, even in the Middle Ages. The specific offenses recognized by secular law often mirrored those of the church, but with different labels or focuses. Simple fornication, sex between two unmarried people, might be treated as a relatively minor offense. In some places, it was primarily handled by church courts, but in others, secular authorities got involved. Manor courts, run by the local lord or his steward, were often the front line of justice for peasants and villagers. If you and your sweetheart were caught in flagrante, or if your relationship became public knowledge and scandalized the neighbors, you might find yourself summoned before the manor court. The penalty for fornication in a manor court was frequently a fine. A few pence perhaps, or a shilling, maybe enough to buy a sheep or several chickens. It wasn't pocket change for a medieval peasant, but it wasn't ruinous either, usually. It was more of a nuisance, a public dressing down, and a financial slap on the wrist. Think of it less as a major crime and more like a parking ticket that you have to pay in front of your neighbors. And you had to pay it to the Lord, which was perhaps part of the point. Generating a little bit of income from the romantic indiscretions of your tenants? Why not? Some lords even had specific customary payments associated with unmarried people having children, like a leaser white or child white, essentially a fine paid to the Lord for having an illegitimate child. It's a bit grim, but for the Lord, it was just another revenue stream. Oh, you've produced an heir outside of wedlock? Jolly good, that'll be 5 shillings, please. Adultery, however, was a far more serious matter in the eyes of secular law, just as it was for the church. Adultery wasn't just a sin, it was seen as a betrayal of the marital contract, a potentially destabilizing force for families, and a direct affront to a husband's honor and property rights. Again, using the unpleasant medieval framing of a wife as a man's possession. It could lead to violent disputes, public disorder, and questions of inheritance legitimacy. Because of its more serious nature, adultery was more likely to be dealt with in higher secular courts, like town courts or, even in some places, royal courts. Penalties for adultery were consequently much harsher than for simple fornication. Fines could be considerably higher, potentially ruinous. Public shaming was common. You might be forced to stand in the stocks in the market square, wearing a sign proclaiming your offense for everyone to see and jeer at. Or perhaps you'd be paraded through town, sometimes subjected to ritual humiliation by your neighbors. In some regions and periods, physical punishments were enacted, though details are often vague in the records. In keeping it PG-13, let's just say medieval authorities could get creative with unpleasant public discomfort. Banishment from the town or village was another possibility, effectively ruining your livelihood and social connections. Unlike a church penance which aimed at spiritual correction, secular punishments were about public deterrence, maintaining social order, and extracting justice or revenue. Imagine the sheer gut-churning dread of knowing your affair had been discovered and that you were about to be hauled before the town magistrates. No hushed confession in a dim corner. This was public disgrace, potentially financial ruin, and the very real possibility of being run out of town. Your reputation, already fragile in a close-knit community, would be utterly destroyed. It wasn't just about your soul, it was about your standing in the world, your ability to earn a living, and your future prospects. That's a pretty strong incentive to, maybe just wait or be exceptionally discreet. Secular courts often relied on community reporting. Presentment juries, groups of local men sworn to report crimes in their area, would inform the court about offenses. If your neighbors suspected you, or if things like a noticeable pregnancy started rumors, you could be reported. This meant the nosy neighbor patrol wasn't just a social nuisance. They were effectively agents of the secular legal system. Keeping secrets was paramount, not just for privacy, but for avoiding fines, public humiliation, and potentially much worse. Trying to explain to the town reeve why you were seen sneaking out of someone's window at 3 a.m., all while your estranged spouse sits glaring from the public gallery? Yeah, not a fun Friday afternoon. The birth of an illegitimate child was a particularly tricky situation from a secular legal standpoint. The child itself wasn't a criminal, but their status as a bastard had profound legal implications, primarily concerning inheritance. In most medieval legal systems, illegitimate children could not inherit land or titles. This was a huge deal in a society where land was the basis of wealth and power. So, if a lord or a wealthy merchant had an illegitimate child, it created legal problems. Who was the father? Was the mother married? Could the child be legitimized? Secular courts sometimes had to grapple with these paternity disputes, often relying on shaky evidence like the mother's sworn testimony or community reputation. Ensuring legitimate heirs was a primary function of marriage from the secular legal perspective, and sex outside marriage, especially resulting in children, directly undermined this. The interaction between church law, canon law, and secular law was complex. Canon courts primarily dealt with matters of marriage validity, divorce or separation, and moral offenses like simple fornication that didn't cause major public scandal. Secular courts handled crimes like adultery, especially when it involved violence or property issues, rape, and public disturbances related to sexual behavior. Sometimes there was overlapping jurisdiction, and you might find yourself facing proceedings in both courts, with different penalties from each. Confession and penance from the church, and a fine and the stocks from the secular authorities. A double whammy for your soul and your backside. A mainstream historical fact is that adultery was widely considered a crime in medieval secular law across Europe, though the specific definition, e.g., was it adultery if only one person was married, or only if the woman was married? And the severity of punishment varied significantly by region and social class. Nobles might face different consequences than peasants, with the focus shifting more towards dynastic implications for the elite. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, consider the concept of mund or munt in some Germanic legal traditions present in parts of the early Middle Ages. This was essentially a man's legal guardianship and authority over a woman, father over daughter, husband over wife. Sexual offenses, especially those against an unmarried woman, could be framed not just as a moral wrong around men, but as a violation of her guardian's mund. The penalty, often a fine paid to the guardian, reflected this idea. It adds a rather transactional layer to personal relationships and highlights how deeply ingrained patriarchal control was in medieval legal systems. Imagine your dad suing your boyfriend not just for your honor, but for infringing on his ownership rights over you. Charming. Historians still argue whether secular law was primarily a tool for enforcing morality or for maintaining social hierarchy and property rights. While laws against fornication and adultery clearly had a moral component, the focus on fines and punishments like public shaming suggests that control of public order, collection of revenue, and the reinforcement of patriarchal structures, especially regarding adultery and inheritance, were equally, if not more, important motivations for secular authorities getting involved in people's private lives. Was the goal to make people virtuous or to keep them quiet and compliant while skimming a bit off the top? It's likely a mix, but the balance is a point of ongoing scholarly debate. So when you considered not waiting until marriage, you weren't just weighing the spiritual consequences of sin or the social fallout of scandal. You also had to factor in the very real possibility of facing secular legal repercussions. A summons to the manor court, a public appearance in the stocks, a hefty fine that could set your family back for months, or even banishment. These were tangible risks. They added another layer of practical deterrence to behavior that went against the established norms. Getting caught wasn't just embarrassing, it could be legally and financially damaging. The combined weight of church law, secular law, and societal expectation created a formidable barrier, or at least a complex minefield, for those who felt like rushing things. It's worth remembering, too, that the effectiveness of these laws varied greatly. In times of weak central authority, or in remote rural areas, enforcement might be lax. But in well-governed towns or on strictly run manors, the secular arm of the law was a force to be reckoned with. And unlike the church, which offered forgiveness through confession and penance, secular law often imposed punishments that were purely punitive or designed for public spectacle. There wasn't a legal equivalent of absolution for your fine or your stint in the stocks. Once the punishment was meted out, it was done, and your reputation was likely permanently stained in the eyes of the community and the local authorities. So, while the church might threaten your soul in the next life, the secular law could make your current life significantly more difficult. Suddenly, that quiet, sanctioned wedding ceremony starts looking a lot more appealing than a starring role in the town square's next shaming session. So you've felt the chill of spiritual guilt settle over you, potentially faced the judgment of the church courts with their penances and soul-searching requirements, and perhaps even run afoul of the secular law, resulting in fines or public humiliation in the stocks. Those were tangible fears affecting your eternal state, your wallet, and your personal freedom. But there was another, perhaps even more pervasive and inescapable force that shaped behavior and instilled caution in the medieval world: the relentless, ever-present pressure of social stigma and community judgment. This wasn't just about God or the king. This was about your neighbors, your family, and everyone you interacted with, day in and day out. In the tightly knit communities of the Middle Ages, whether a small village, a bustling market town, or even a noble household, anonymity was practically non-existent. Everyone knew everyone, or at least knew of everyone. Your life was an open book, or at least a book being constantly read and annotated by everyone else. This meant that your reputation wasn't just a personal matter, it was a community asset or liability. What people thought of you directly impacted your social standing, your economic opportunities, your ability to find a suitable marriage partner, and even the way you were treated in casual interactions. A damaged reputation could be crippling, potentially more damaging in the long run than a single fine or a few Hail Marys. Getting caught not waiting until marriage, or even just being suspected of it, could unleash the full force of community disapproval. This often manifested first and foremost as gossip, medieval gossip, faster than a carrier pigeon, more persistent than a leaky roof, incapable of spreading like wildfire, fueled by righteous indignation and sheer nosiness. Whispers in the market square, hushed conversations over the well, knowing glances across the pews in church. It was a constant, low-level hum that could make your life miserable. You might find people suddenly less willing to trade with you, less friendly during festivals, and quick to ostracize you or your family. It wasn't just passive disapproval, it was active social exclusion. Trying to pretend everything was fine while half the village avoided eye contact or muttered behind their hands must have been an incredibly isolating and stressful experience. It's like being permanently stuck in that awkward moment when you wave at someone who wasn't waving at you, but magnified by the entire population and lasting for months or years. Public shaming was a particularly potent tool of social control, often working hand in hand with or going beyond official legal punishments. While the stocks might be ordered in a court, the true sting came from the public spectacle, the jeering, the throwing of rotten vegetables, if you were lucky, just vegetables, the sheer humiliation of being exposed and ridiculed in front of everyone you knew. But even without official punishment, communities sometimes enacted their own forms of ritualistic shaming. One of the most famous was the Charivari, or rough music, though this was more often used against couples seen as mismatched, abusive spouses, or those who remarried too quickly. However, similar noisy, mocking processions could be directed at individuals, especially women, accused of sexual misconduct. Imagine a raucous crowd showing up outside your house at night, banging pots and pans, blowing horns, and shouting insults. It wasn't illegal in the way theft was, but it was a terrifying and deeply shaming experience designed to make you conform or leave. For women, the social consequences of premarital or extramarital sex were often far more severe than for men, particularly if a pregnancy resulted. An unmarried pregnant woman or a single mother faced immense stigma. She might be cast out by her family, struggled to find work, as her ability to perform manual labor was impacted, and her reputation made her undesirable, and faced constant judgment. The child, born a bastard, also carried a social burden, and as we touched on with secular law, faced legal disadvantages regarding inheritance. While men involved might have faced fines or a temporary blip in their reputation, the social cost for the woman could be permanent and devastating. Her prospects for a future marriage, especially a good one, would plummet. Her honor, inextricably linked to her virginity before marriage and fidelity within it, would be seen as compromised, potentially making her less valuable in the marriage market. Yes, marriage was often seen as a form of social and economic transaction, and a tarnished reputation lowered your price, so to speak. It was a harsh reality. Your value as a potential spouse was tied to your adherence to strict sexual norms. Families also bore the brunt of the social fallout. A daughter's or son's indiscretion could stain the family name, impacting the marriage prospects of their siblings, the family's standing in the community, and their ability to conduct business or secure favorable arrangements. Parents might pressure or even force children to marry quickly, regardless of suitability, just to avoid the shame of an illegitimate child or persistent gossip. The weight of tradition and the fear of social ostracism meant that families often became the primary enforcers of these norms, desperate to maintain their respectability. You weren't just risking your reputation, you were risking the family's reputation, which was a collective burden and a powerful motivator for conformity. Neighbors, far from being neutral observers, were active participants in maintaining social order. They were the ones spreading the gossip, the ones potentially reporting suspicious behavior to manor courts or church officials, and the ones participating in shaming rituals. Why? Partly out of genuine belief in the moral code, partly out of fear that their own community's reputation would suffer if such behavior was tolerated, and partly, Maisha, Ari, let's be honest, because watching other people get into trouble was the prime form of medieval entertainment. Forget Netflix, the real drama was happening next door, involving Farmer Giles and the blacksmith's daughter. Keeping up appearances and ensuring your family was seen as respectable wasn't just about personal pride. It was a necessary defense against the constant surveillance and judgment of the community. The concept of good neighborhood was actually quite important in medieval towns and villages. Being a good neighbor meant not only helping out in practical ways, but also upholding shared moral standards. Conversely, engaging in behavior deemed scandalous, like premarital sex or adultery, could make you a bad neighbor, someone disrupting the social fabric. This wasn't just informal. In some town charters or manor customs, there were explicit expectations about the behavior of residents, and public scandal could be brought before local assemblies for judgment. The community wasn't just watching, it had formal and informal mechanisms for enforcing its expectations. Consider the psychological toll of living under this constant social microscope. Every interaction, every glance, every whispered conversation could feel loaded. You might become hyper-aware of your behavior, paranoid about being seen in the wrong place at the wrong time, or even just talking to the wrong person. This pressure to conform was immense, shaping daily life in ways that are hard for us to fully grasp in our more individualistic, anonymous societies. While we might worry about what people say about us on social media, the medieval equivalent was happening face-to-face every single day with people you depended on for your livelihood and social support. A mainstream historical fact is that reputation was arguably the most valuable social currency in medieval communities, particularly for women, and deviations from sexual norms could inflict irreparable damage on it, severely limiting future opportunities, especially for marriage. This wasn't just a moral failing, it was an economic and social disaster. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, in some parts of medieval England, there's evidence of community assemblies or courts where neighbors would collectively decide on punishments or reconciliation for minor offenses or breaches of social norms, sometimes involving rituals that reinforce the idea of community cohesion. These weren't formal legal courts, but rather community-managed sessions where public opinion and shared values held sway, demonstrating the direct power neighbors wielded over each other's lives and reputations outside of official structures. Historians still argue whether the primary motivator for individuals to conform to sexual norms was genuine belief in religious doctrine, fear of legal punishment, or the crushing weight of social pressure and the need to maintain a good reputation. While all three factors were undoubtedly influential, the relative importance of each and how that varied by region, social class, and individual circumstances remains a complex and open scholarly debate. Were people more afraid of hell, the stocks, or their neighbors' wagging tongues? It likely depended a lot on who and where you were. So if you were contemplating a romantic liaison outside the bounds of marriage, you had to factor in not just the judgment of God and the potential penalties of the law, but also the inescapable scrutiny and disapproval of everyone around you. The whispers, the cold shoulders, the ruined reputation that could follow you for years and impact your family. These were powerful deterrents. They created an environment where secrecy was paramount, discretion was survival, and adherence to established norms was often the path of least resistance. It wasn't just about avoiding punishment, it was about preserving your place within the community and ensuring a viable future for yourself and your family. Suddenly, that quiet, sanctioned walk down the aisle felt less like a restriction and more like a necessary gateway to social acceptance and stability. The pressure wasn't just external, it was woven into the very fabric of daily medieval life, a constant reminder that your private actions had very public consequences. So you've absorbed the pervasive dread of divine judgment, the tangible threat of legal penalties, and the suffocating weight of community gossip and shaming. You understand that getting caught wasn't just a minor embarrassment. It could fundamentally alter the course of your life and your family's standing. Given all this pressure, you might think people would simply stop, end the secret rendezvous, quench the illicit flame, buckle down and wait for a sanctioned marriage, or just accept being alone. But human nature, as it often does, found ways. The desire for intimacy, companionship, or simply youthful passion sometimes proves stronger than the fear, leading you down a path where secrecy became not just desirable, but absolutely essential for survival. Maintaining that secrecy, however, under the constant watchful eye of the medieval community, as we talked about last section, they loved watching you, was an Olympic sport of discretion. Forget elaborate spy gadgets. Your main tools were timing, darkness, and a carefully constructed web of plausible lies or convenient absences. Meetings would happen after dark, in quiet, out-of-the-way places. A barn after the animals were settled, a secluded corner of a forest, a back alley behind the market after everyone had gone home. You'd have to coordinate signals, a specific piece of clothing left in a certain spot, a cough at a particular time, a coded phrase slipped into seemingly innocent conversation. The stakes were incredibly high. Being seen together, even just walking down the street at an unusual hour, could spark whispers that would quickly grow into shouts. Imagine the anxiety. Every rustle in the bushes, every unexpected footstep, every distant light could send your heart pounding. You'd be constantly scanning your surroundings, ears straining for any sound that wasn't nature or the predictable noises of the household or village. You'd have to come up with excuses for being out late, for having muddy boots at an odd hour, for that suspicious smudge on your cheek, and that definitely wasn't from kissing behind the haystack. Living like that, perpetually on edge, must have been exhausting. It wasn't a carefree romance. It was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse with your entire community playing the role of the cat. And the cat had many, many eyes. But despite the risks, relationships continued, fueled by desire, affection, or sometimes just practical necessity in a harsh world. And sometimes, inevitably, despite all the whispered plans and furtive meetings, the biological reality of the situation became undeniable. The missed cycles, the growing belly, pregnancy was the ultimate unavoidable evidence that you hadn't waited. And in the medieval world, for an unmarried woman, pregnancy was arguably the most catastrophic outcome. It wasn't just a personal challenge, it was a public announcement of transgression, a tangible embodiment of sin and scandal that couldn't be hidden forever. The options available when facing an unmarried pregnancy were grim and limited. As briefly mentioned earlier, abortion existed, but it was incredibly dangerous, often lethal to the woman, and universally condemned by the church as murder. Infanticide, while tragically it did happen in some desperate cases, was also considered a grave sin and a serious crime, punishable by death. Concealment was difficult. Rural communities weren't exactly teeming with discreet doctors or places to hide for 9 months, and childbirth is, shall we say, not a silent affair. The most common and often the only viable path open was a desperate attempt to legitimize the situation before the birth made it impossible to hide or before the scandal erupted fully. This usually meant one thing: marriage. Forced marriage became a tragically frequent outcome of premarital pregnancy. The families involved, desperate to salvage their honor and avoid the social and legal repercussions of an illegitimate child, would exert immense pressure on the couple to marry immediately. Forget romantic proposals. This was often a hurried, reluctant march to the altar, driven by shame and necessity. The families might negotiate the terms, who would pay what dowry, perhaps reduced due to the circumstances, where the couple would live, but the primary goal was to get them married before the child was born, thus making the child legitimate in the eyes of the church and usually the secular law. This wasn't about love, it was damage control, a pragmatic, if brutal, solution to a potentially ruinous problem. Imagine being forced to marry someone under these circumstances. You might not love them, you might not even particularly like them. You're marrying them because a biological event has forced your hand, because your families are demanding it, because the alternative is social ruin. Your future, potentially lifelong, is decided not by mutual affection or careful planning, but by a moment of passion or carelessness. Such marriages were unlikely to be happy unions, often starting with resentment, obligation, and the heavy weight of the circumstances under which they were formed. It was a far cry from the idealized, though still practical, vision of marriage that medieval society held up. If, for whatever reason, marriage wasn't possible, perhaps one partner was already married, leading to adultery, an even graver sin crime. Perhaps the man refused to marry the woman, a difficult but sometimes attempted option for men, leaving the woman to face the consequences alone. Or perhaps the social gap between the families was too wide to bridge even under pressure. Then the child would be born out of wedlock, an illegitimate child, or a bastard. This status carried significant disadvantages from the moment of birth, following the child throughout their life. The primary consequence of illegitimacy, as hinted at previously in a mainstream historical fact, was the severe restriction or complete denial of inheritance rights. Medieval society placed huge importance on lineage and the transmission of property, titles, and status down the family line. An illegitimate child, not being legally recognized as a direct heir, could not typically inherit from their father, and often faced restrictions inheriting from their mother's family too, particularly landed property. This could mean a life of poverty and limited opportunity compared to their legitimate siblings or cousins. It wasn't just about money, it was about social standing, access to resources, and your place in the world. For noble families, an illegitimate child could be a major problem for succession planning, potentially leading to disputes or the sidelining of the child. For peasant families, it might mean one less hand to inherit and work the family land, potentially fragmenting the holding or forcing the child into landless labor. Beyond inheritance, illegitimate children often face social stigma themselves. They might be blamed for their parents' impermission, treated differently by the community, and find it harder to make a good marriage themselves later in life, as their status reflected negatively on their potential spouse's family. While some illegitimate or children of wealthy fathers might be provided for financially or even given education, often directed towards the church, as clergy couldn't inherit property, the vast majority faced a life of hardship and marginalization. They were, in a very real sense, paying the price for their parents' actions. It's a grim reminder that in medieval society, personal sins had consequences that rippled outwards, affecting future generations and reinforcing the strict social code. It wasn't just about the individuals, it was about the maintenance of the social order itself. Occasionally faced with the impossibility of marriage, the shame, and the inability to support a child, unmarried mothers would resort to desperate measures. This might include trying to pass the child off as someone else's, difficult but sometimes attempted, moving to a different, more anonymous town, if such a place existed and they had the means to travel, or in the most tragic circumstances, abandonment. Foundlings, children left at church doors or in other public places, were a sad reality in medieval society, a testament to the impossible situations some individuals faced. While some monasteries or charitable institutions might take in foundlings, their fate was precarious, often involving a life of servitude or poverty. This isn't to dwell on the grim details, but to highlight just how severe the consequences of an unmarried pregnancy could be, pushing people to the absolute extremes of their limited options. It paints a stark picture of the lack of a social safety net and the brutal effectiveness of the social and religious pressures at play. For a quirky or fringe tidbit, some historians have noted the existence of lying-in practices, where a pregnant woman might go to stay with relatives in a different village for the final months of pregnancy and childbirth, specifically to conceal her condition from her home community or to give birth in a place where the paternity could be more easily obscured or lied about. This wasn't common, but it shows the lengths people might go to avoid the social fallout, highlighting the ingenuity and the desperation involved in trying to navigate these impossible situations under constant scrutiny. It's the medieval equivalent of disappearing from social media for 9 months. Historians still argue whether the rate of premarital pregnancy was significantly lower in the Middle Ages than in later periods, despite the intense pressures and punishments, or if the pressures simply led to more desperate measures of concealment or infanticide, masking the true prevalence. Some scholars point to relatively low recorded numbers in court records as evidence of effective deterrence, while others argue that the very nature of the penalties, especially social stigma, meant that cases were successfully hidden or dealt with informally within families, making them invisible to official records and suggesting a higher actual rate. It's a fascinating, albeit somber, open scholarly debate about how effective medieval controls truly were versus the realities of human behavior. Were people genuinely deterred or just getting really, really good at hiding things? So you see, the path of not waiting until marriage was fraught with peril far beyond just abstract sin or a simple fine. It could lead to a forced union, a life of resentment, or the birth of a child who would forever bear the mark of illegitimacy, facing a future severely constrained by social and legal barriers. The practical consequences were devastating, weaving together the threads of religious morality, secular law, and social judgment into a net that was incredibly difficult to escape once you were caught. These weren't just theoretical fears, they were real-life outcomes that shaped families, determined inheritances, and dictated the very opportunities available to individuals born into such circumstances. It makes you appreciate, perhaps just a little bit, the relative privacy and fewer existential consequences of our own relationship complexities today. Though, admittedly, we don't have forced marriages to salvage reputations quite in the same way. Probably a good thing, all told. So you've absorbed the pervasive dread of divine judgment, the tangible threat of legal penalties, and the suffocating weight of community gossip and shaming. You understand that getting caught wasn't just a minor embarrassment. It could fundamentally alter the course of your life and your family's standing. Given all this pressure, you might think people would simply stop, end the secret rendezvous, quench the illicit flame, buckle down and wait for a sanctioned marriage, or just accept being alone. But human nature, as it often does, found ways. The desire for intimacy, companionship, or simply youthful passion sometimes proves stronger than the fear, leading you down a path where secrecy became not just desirable, but absolutely essential for survival. We just talked about the absolute disaster of pregnancy outside marriage, forcing rushed unions or leaving children without legal standing. But what about relationships that weren't necessarily about getting married or where formal marriage wasn't possible? Did everyone fit neatly into the box of single and chaste or safely married? Of course not. Life is messier than a monk's vow of poverty in a bakery. The medieval world, despite its rigid moral framework and legal structures, wasn't monolithic or perfectly enforced. Beneath the surface of ideal Christian marriage, you could find a whole spectrum of relationships that existed in a sort of gray area, not quite sanctioned, but perhaps tolerated to varying degrees depending on who you were, where you lived, and who your partner was. This is where we delve into the realm of concubinage and other forms of informal cohabitation, arrangements that existed alongside marriage but fell short of its legal and religious standing. These weren't typically about casual encounters. They were often long-term relationships, sometimes even involving shared households and children, yet lacking the formal blessings and legal protections of matrimony. Think of concubinage less as a modern affair and more as a recognized, though often disapproved, alternative or substitute for marriage. For a man, taking a concubine could be a pragmatic choice. Maybe he couldn't afford the costs associated with a formal marriage, the bride price or dowry, the wedding feast, setting up a separate household, or perhaps the ongoing financial obligations to his wife's family. Maybe he was of a social status that made marriage difficult or undesirable with the women available to him. Perhaps he was waiting for a political or economic opportunity to make a better marriage later, using a concubine for companionship and domestic needs in the meantime. For clergy, famously forbidden from marrying, concubinage was a persistent issue, a direct violation of their vows, yet common enough to be a constant source of complaint and legislation from church authorities who just couldn't seem to stamp it out, no matter how hard they tried. It was like medieval whack-a-mole, but with less mallet swinging and more sternly worded letters from bishops. For the woman involved, becoming a concubine was often a path born of necessity or limited options. She might be poor, lacking a dowry to make a desirable marriage. She might have been widowed and unable to remarry advantageously, but needed economic support. She might simply have fallen for a man who couldn't or wouldn't marry her formally, but offered her some level of security and status, precarious though it was. Life as a concubine, while potentially offering some material comfort compared to poverty, was inherently insecure. You lacked the legal rights of a wife. Your partner could leave you relatively easily, and you had little recourse. You weren't part of his legal family structure, and your status in the community was ambiguous at best, potentially marked by shame or disapproval, especially from the more devout or respectable neighbors. You were living essentially without a safety net made of marriage certificates. The church's stance on concubinage was clear and consistently negative. It was considered a form of fornication or adultery, a sin against the sacrament of marriage. Even if you weren't married yourself, it was seen as undermining the institution. Church councils and sermons condemned it, urging men to marry or remain chaste, and women to seek honorable marriage or live virtuously alone. You might face excommunication or other religious penalties if your concubinage was public knowledge and you refused to end it. However, the reality on the ground was often different. Local clergy might turn a blind eye, especially if the man was wealthy or powerful. The practice was so common, particularly among soldiers, merchants who traveled frequently, or indeed clergy, that outright eradication was impossible. It was a sort of open secret, something everyone knew happened, but pretended not to notice too loudly unless a scandal forced their hand. Secular law was a bit more varied and complex regarding concubinage. It generally didn't offer the same protections as marriage. The concubine had no right to her partner's property upon his death, unlike a wife who was entitled to dower rights, a portion of his estate. Children born to a concubine were typically considered illegitimate, with all the inheritance disadvantages we had discussed last section. However, in some regions, or for certain classes, customs or specific legal provisions might exist. A wealthy man might make provisions for his concubine and her children in his will, though this could be challenged by his legitimate family. Some urban areas or guilds might have specific rules regarding members and their non-marital partners. A fascinating, albeit a quirky or fringe tidbit, is that in some places, particularly in medieval Spain under Castilian law, if a man and woman lived together openly as husband and wife for a significant period and raised children, it could, under certain circumstances, be later recognized as a form of legitimate union, or at least grant the children some inheritance rights, even without a formal church wedding. It was a rare exception, highlighting the tension between formal law and social reality, but it shows that not every single non-marital union was universally treated the same way everywhere. Beyond concubinage, which often implied a recognized long-term partner, even if not a wife, there were simpler forms of cohabitation. Two people might just start living together, sharing resources and domestic life, without any formal declaration or intent of marriage. This was probably more common among the poor, where the economic advantages of pooling labor and resources might outweigh the social pressure to marry formally, especially if they couldn't afford it anyway. Imagine a couple of landless peasants struggling to survive, sharing a hut, working together, supporting each other. This practical partnership might be far more pressing than obtaining a piece of parchment from the church. These relationships were even more precarious than concubinage. They had no legal standing whatsoever, no rights to property, and children would be illegitimate. The church would still condemn it, but perhaps the social visibility was lower, especially in busy towns or less tightly controlled rural fringes. It was living off the grid, medieval style. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Despite the church's persistent efforts and the legal disadvantages, concubinage and informal cohabitation were widespread realities across medieval Europe, from royal courts to peasant cottages. They weren't the ideal, but they were common enough to be constantly legislated against, preached about, and depicted, often negatively, in literature and art. The simple fact that the authorities had to keep talking about it issuing decrees and lamenting the behavior, tells you just how prevalent it was. If no one was doing it, they wouldn't need to bother. It was like medieval nagging on a continental scale. Living in one of these arrangements would have felt very different from being married. The insecurity, the lack of full acceptance, the constant awareness that your status was less than, it would color your daily life. For the woman especially, it was a vulnerable position. You might be deeply loved and well treated, but your position depended entirely on the goodwill of your partner. If he died without making provisions for you, you could be left destitute. If he decided he wanted to make a proper marriage, you could be cast aside. There were no divorce courts to protect you, no community property laws. Your domestic labor, your companionship, perhaps even children, none of it necessarily translated into rights or security. It was a gamble, one often taken out of necessity or limited options rather than purely romantic choice. Historians still argue whether these informal unions represented a form of resistance to the rigid structure of medieval marriage, or simply a pragmatic adaptation to economic and social constraints. Some scholars see them as evidence that people found ways to form meaningful bonds outside the church's control, perhaps prioritizing economic survival or personal preference over religious dictates. Others argue that the significant disadvantages and insecurities associated with concubinage and cohabitation demonstrate the overwhelming power of the formal marriage system, and that these were mostly arrangements of last resort or privilege for the men involved, rather than deliberate countercultural choices. It's a complex question about agency versus constraint in the medieval world. Were these relationships a quiet rebellion, or just making the best of a bad hand? The existence of these alternative relationships, while not sanctioned, shows the complexity of medieval life. Not everyone fit the mold. Necessity, desire, and circumstance push people into different kinds of unions, each with its own set of rules, often unwritten, benefits, and considerable risks. They highlight the gap between the ideal preached by the church and the messy reality of human relationships unfolding within economic hardship, social hierarchies, and enduring desires. While they offered companionship and practical support, they also came with significant insecurity and social stigma, reminding everyone involved that they were operating outside the main system, navigating a world where status and legitimacy were paramount, and where being on the fringes meant you were far more exposed to the elements. So, you've heard the fire and brimstone, you've seen the scary pictures on the church wall, and you know the church is watching, or at least making sure its representatives are. Now comes the inevitable, potentially stomach-churning reality of dealing with those rules when you haven't quite stuck to them. And the primary mechanism for dealing with your inevitable spiritual slip-ups was, as we touched on, the confessional. Imagine it. You're approaching the time for your annual confession, usually mandated before Easter communion, though you might go more often if you felt particularly burdened by sin, or if your priest was very persuasive. You've been holding on to, well, let's just say some memories from that night down by the old mill, or that time you lingered a little too long with someone who wasn't your spouse or future spouse. The weight of those actions, amplified by the constant reminders of potential hellfire, feels heavy. You know you have to confess. Not confessing means risking damnation even more acutely, as you'd be adding the sin of concealing a mortal sin to the list. It's a spiritual catch-22. You'd likely join a line outside the designated confessional space, which wasn't always a fancy wooden box like you might picture today. Sometimes it was just a private corner of the church, or a side chapel, where you'd kneel before the priest. The atmosphere would be hushed, perhaps dimly lit, smelling of old stone, stale incense, and maybe the damp wool clothes of the people around you. You'd hear the low murmur of voices from other confessions, adding to the sense of private solemnity mixed with a definite dose of anxiety. What would the priest ask? Would he already suspect something? When it's your turn, you approach the kneeling bench. The priest is likely seated, perhaps behind a grill or just facing away slightly to offer some anonymity, though in a small village, he might know you well enough to recognize your breathing pattern. You make the sign of the cross and begin the ritual opening. Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been time period since my last confession. My sins are, and then the hard part. Confessing sexual sins was notoriously difficult for medieval people. Shame, social stigma, and the deeply ingrained sense of the sacredness of the body made it agonizing to articulate these transgressions to another person, especially one who was supposed to be holy and celibate. You might stumble over your words, your voice barely a whisper. Sweat might prickle on your brow despite the cool church air. Your heart would likely be pounding. The priest, for his part, was armed with more than just his training. As we mentioned, he had those confessional manuals. These manuals were fascinatingly detailed guides for priests, designed to help them probe the consciences of their flock and uncover hidden sins. They weren't just theological texts. They were practical handbooks on how to conduct an interrogation, albeit a spiritual one. They listed categories of sin, degrees of severity, and crucially, questions to ask the penitent. And when it came to sexual sins, these questions could be incredibly specific, bordering on intrusive. Imagine the priest calmly asking, "Have you sinned against the sixth commandment, adultery, fornication? With whom? Were they married or unmarried? Were you? How many times? At what time of day? In what manner?" Yes, in what manner was sometimes on the list. The manuals often went into granular detail about different acts, their perceived gravity, and the circumstances that might mitigate or aggravate the sin, e.g., committing the act on a holy day, using contraception, violence, or involving someone underage or related. This specificity reveals a couple of things. First, it shows that medieval people were engaging in a wide range of sexual behaviors that the church considered sinful, because why else would they need manuals listing them all? Second, it shows the church's deep concern and systematic effort to police not just the fact of the sin, but its every imaginable variation. For you, the penitent, it meant the potential for deep embarrassment. You might have gone in prepared to mumble something vague about impurity, only to have the priest press you for details you absolutely did not want to share. It was a stripping away of privacy in the name of spiritual cleansing. Given the pressure, the shame, and the potential consequences, it's no surprise that people developed strategies for navigating the confessional. One common approach, though technically a sin itself, was to minimize the transgression. Instead of saying, "I slept with Thomas several times," you might say, "I committed a sin of the flesh." The hope was that the priest wouldn't probe further, or perhaps wouldn't understand the full extent of what you were confessing. Another more dangerous strategy was partial confession or mental reservation. This involved confessing only certain sins while deliberately concealing others, or confessing a sin in a way that was technically true but intentionally misleading. For example, confessing lustful thoughts while omitting the actual act of fornication. This was highly risky from the church's perspective, as intentionally concealing a mortal sin made the entire confession invalid and added the sin of lying in confession. Priests were warned in their manuals to be alert to vague or evasive answers and to probe deeper. You might also try to seek out a priest known for being more lenient. Word of mouth travels, even in medieval villages. "Oh, Father Michael in the next parish? He's much easier than Father Thomas here. He just gives you a few prayers and doesn't ask too many questions." Traveling a bit further for a more comfortable confession was probably a tempting prospect for many. Or you might try the classic deflection technique, confessing a long list of minor sins to make the priest think you were being thorough, hoping he wouldn't have the time or inclination to dig for the big ones. "Yes, Father, I gossiped about Agnes's new hat. I was late for matins twice. I took an extra potato from the communal storage, and I had impure thoughts about potatoes." Okay, maybe not the last part, but you get the idea. The absolute bravest, or perhaps most foolhardy, tactic was outright lying, denying a sin you committed. The terror of being caught, however, either by the priest or worse, by God himself who sees everything, was a powerful deterrent. Confessing truthfully, even with the shame, was seen as the path to forgiveness and avoiding eternal punishment. After you confessed, assuming you were judged to be genuinely contrite, showed sorrow for your sins, the priest would grant you absolution, forgiving your sins in the name of God. But you weren't quite done. Absolution came with a price: penance. Penance was not considered punishment per se, but rather a form of satisfaction or atonement for the harm caused by your sin, both to yourself and to the divine order. It was meant to purify your soul, demonstrate your sincerity, and help you avoid future sins. The severity and nature of the penance varied hugely depending on the sin, its frequency, the penitent's social status. Sometimes the wealthy got off easier, sometimes they were held to a higher standard, and the priest's discretion. For simple fornication, a common penance might involve reciting specific prayers, say 7 Pater Nosters and 7 Ave Marias daily for a week, or maybe for 40 days, symbolizing Christ's time in the wilderness. Seems simple enough until you realize how long it takes to genuinely focus on reciting those prayers, especially on top of a full day of work. For more serious or repeated offenses, or if the sin involved additional factors, like adultery or public scandal, the penance escalated. Strict fasting was a common penance, sometimes involving eating only bread and water for certain periods or abstaining from specific foods. This wasn't just uncomfortable. For someone already living on a subsistence diet, it could be genuinely difficult and weaken them. Wearing sackcloth, a rough, uncomfortable fabric, as a form of humble self-mortification might be required. Even more demanding penances included periods of silence, sleeping on the bare ground, or vigils involving hours of prayer during the night. The most arduous penance, often reserved for very grave sins or repeat offenders, was pilgrimage. Being sent on pilgrimage meant leaving your home, your family, and your livelihood for weeks, months, or even years to travel to a distant shrine like Canterbury, Rome, or even Jerusalem. Pilgrimages were incredibly dangerous, expensive, and physically demanding journeys fraught with risks of robbery, illness, and accidents. Completing a pilgrimage was seen as a powerful act of atonement, literally a physical and spiritual journey of purification. Imagine confessing a youthful indiscretion and being told your penance is to walk to Rome. That would certainly make you think twice next time. In cases where the sin caused public scandal, the penance might be public. This could involve standing outside the church door during Mass, wearing a distinctive garment, or holding a candle, so the entire community knew you were undergoing penance. This was deeply humiliating and could have lasting effects on your reputation and social standing. Your chances of making a good marriage, if you weren't already married, might plummet. Even if you were already married, the shame would ripple through your family. The execution of penance wasn't always perfectly monitored. You told the priest you'd say the prayers, but did you really? You were supposed to fast, but did you sneak an extra crust? This brings us to an area where historians still argue whether the system of confession and penance was truly effective in reforming behavior, or if it became, for many, a ritualistic cycle of sin, confession, penance, and then back to sinning again. Was it a genuine spiritual transformation for the masses, or a social mechanism that reinforced communal norms through periodic purification rituals? Some historians will argue that the constant cycle of confession and penance, while perhaps not eliminating sin, kept people constantly aware of the Church's moral code and provided a structured way to alleviate the crushing burden of guilt. It was a spiritual pressure valve. Others suggest that the very routinization of it might have lessened its impact, turning penance into a box-ticking exercise rather than a profound act of contrition. People might have become adept at managing their spiritual accounts, balancing sins against penances. Okay, I can afford this sin now, I'll just add another dozen Hail Marys to my list. A quirky tidbit about navigating penance: some people would hire others to perform acts of penance for them, particularly lengthy prayers or even pilgrimages. Wealthy individuals, too busy or perhaps too soft for the rigors of serious penance, could literally pay someone else to pray or walk for them. This practice was eventually condemned by the Church, as penance was meant to be a personal act of atonement, but its existence shows the ways people sought to mitigate the practical burden of spiritual discipline. It's the medieval equivalent of paying someone to go to the gym for you. Great for your schedule, maybe less so for your soul's fitness. The mainstream historical fact is the compulsory nature of annual confession and communion. reinforced by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, making the confessional a central pillar of medieval religious life and a primary interface between the individual and the institutional church's moral authority. This wasn't optional, it was a required part of being a practicing Catholic. So for a medieval person involved in a relationship outside of marriage, the confessional loomed large. It was the place where your private life intersected most directly with the church's power. It was a source of anxiety, shame, and potential discomfort, but also the pathway to forgiveness and spiritual peace, albeit via reciting countless prayers, enduring hunger, or embarking on epic journeys. It was a system that simultaneously highlighted the impossibility of living up to divine standards and provided a mechanism, however imperfectly utilized, for trying to bridge the gap between earthly desires and heavenly aspirations. Navigating it successfully meant mastering a complex interplay of piety, strategic honesty, and perhaps a little bit of hoping the priest was having an easy day. It was all part of the elaborate dance between doctrine and desire in medieval life. So you've been through the ringer of confession, perhaps mumbled your way through uncomfortable questions, and walked away with a list of prayers to say or fast to endure. That's one path, the path of seeking spiritual reconciliation. After the fact. But what happened if you didn't confess, or if your actions became public knowledge, or if they were considered not just a sin against God, but a crime against society or the established order? That's when the system shifted from private spiritual penance to more formal, often public, and sometimes deeply punitive measures. You weren't just dealing with the shame before your priest, you might be facing the judgment of your peers, the authority of the church courts, or even the sharp end of secular law. Imagine the whispers starting. Maybe that late-night rendezvous by the river wasn't as secret as you thought. Perhaps a jealous neighbor saw something, or a disgruntled relative wanted to cause trouble, or worse, your private life became the subject of official inquiry. In the medieval world, privacy as we know it was pretty limited, and communities were often tight-knit, watchful, and not shy about reporting perceived transgressions, especially those that threatened the moral fabric they believed held everything together. If your actions came to light, you might find yourself summoned, not to the confessional, but to court. There were generally two main legal systems you might encounter: the church courts, ecclesiastical courts, and the secular courts, those run by kings, lords, or towns. Both had an interest in regulating behavior, including sexual conduct, though their jurisdictions and priorities could sometimes overlap or even conflict. The church courts held significant power over what were considered moral offenses. They had jurisdiction over marriage disputes, issues of legitimacy, oaths, blasphemy, and crucially, sins that caused public scandal. Fornication and adultery often fell under their purview, especially if they involved clergy, betrothed individuals, or caused significant disruption in the community. Being summoned to the church court could be intimidating. You'd appear before officials, likely clerics learned in canon law, who would hear accusations, examine witnesses, and pass judgment. The punishments handed down by church courts for sexual offenses varied. They could range from relatively mild, like imposing specific public penances, which were distinct from the private penances given in confession. These public penances might involve standing outside the church door during Mass, holding a candle, or wearing a specific garment of shame, perhaps a white sheet or a sign listing your offense. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deeply humiliating, broadcasting your transgression to everyone you knew. More severe punishments included fines, which could be hefty depending on your means. The church courts, like secular ones, often use fines as a way to punish and also to generate revenue, a kind of sin tax. Imagine being forced to pay a significant portion of your savings or even livestock just because you couldn't wait until the wedding night. It added a very tangible economic dimension to the cost of transgressing norms. For repeat offenders or particularly scandalous cases, excommunication was a terrifying possibility. Excommunication wasn't just a spiritual wrist slap, it had profound social and legal consequences. An excommunicated person was formally cast out of the church community. This meant you couldn't receive the sacraments, no communion, no confession, until you repented, and sought reconciliation. No Christian burial. Spiritually, this was seen as condemning you to hell, but it also had earthly repercussions. You were shunned by your community, as associating with an excommunicated person could put others at spiritual risk. Furthermore, in many places, excommunicated individuals lost certain legal rights. They couldn't give evidence in court, sue someone, or sometimes even hold property. It effectively made you a legal and social pariah. It was the medieval equivalent of being completely canceled, but with eternal damnation thrown in. Secular courts also got involved, particularly with offenses that disturbed the peace, involved violence, or were seen as crimes against property or status. Adultery, especially by a wife, was often treated seriously in secular law because it could mess with inheritance, introducing non-heirs, and was seen as a violation of the husband's rights. Punishments for adultery in secular courts could be severe, sometimes even involving corporal punishment or, in rare and particularly harsh instances, depending on the region and time period, execution, especially for the woman. For men, the penalties were often less severe, perhaps fines or banishment. Simple fornication, sex between unmarried people, was sometimes seen as less serious by secular authorities unless it led to public disorder or involved other crimes. However, it could still incur penalties, especially in towns which often had their own bylaws aimed at maintaining public order and morality. These town ordinances might impose fines or temporary banishment. The stocks or the pillory were common tools of public shaming used by secular authorities for a variety of minor offenses, and sexual misconduct could definitely land you there. Picture this: you're locked into the stocks in the market square, perhaps pelted with rotten fruit or insults by your neighbors, your dignity stripped away in front of the whole community. It was a powerful deterrent, not just because of the physical discomfort, but because of the intense social humiliation. Your reputation, already fragile, could be utterly ruined. Future marriage prospects? Forget about it. Your standing in guilds or community organizations? Probably gone. This was punishment designed to scar you socially as much as physically or financially. A particularly quirky tidbit about public punishment relates to specific tools of shame used in some areas. For instance, in some German towns, persistent adulterers or fornicators might be forced to wear a shame cloak, Schandmantel, a heavy barrel-like contraption that was incredibly awkward and hot, forcing them to walk around the town as a spectacle. Or a cuckold's horn might be hung around the neck of a man whose wife committed adultery, a physical symbol of his supposed emasculation and shame. These weren't just symbolic, they were designed to inflict maximum social stigma and discomfort. Historians still argue whether the existence of both ecclesiastical and secular legal systems was a benefit or a hindrance to justice. Did it create a safety net, ensuring that even if one court overlooked a sin crime, the other might catch it? Or did it create confusion, potential double jeopardy, being punished by both courts for the same offense, and opportunities for the wealthy or well-connected to play one system against the other? There's evidence for both perspectives. Sometimes church courts push secular authorities to act, and vice versa, particularly in cases of clergy misconduct or major scandals. Other times, they might have had different interpretations of what constituted a severe offense or who had the primary right to prosecute. The mainstream historical fact here is the pervasive role of church courts, official name, ecclesiastical courts, or consistory courts in England, in the daily lives of medieval people holding significant legal authority over personal conduct, including sexual morality alongside secular law. This dual system of law and punishment meant that transgressing sexual norms could have consequences that extended far beyond the spiritual realm of sin and penance, impacting your social status, your finances, and your physical well-being. You might be wondering, did these punishments actually work as deterrents? Did the threat of public shame, fines, or excommunication stop people from engaging in premarital or extramarital sex? Well, clearly not entirely, given the need for all these elaborate systems of detection, confession, and punishment. Human desire, opportunity, and complex relationships often prove more powerful than the fear of consequences. However, the systems undoubtedly shaped behavior. They pushed activity into the shadows, encouraged secrecy, and meant that getting caught was a serious matter with potentially devastating repercussions. The ever-present possibility of being reported, summoned, tried, and publicly shamed or fined would have been a constant background anxiety for anyone straying from the prescribed path. Consider the economic impact too. For a peasant family, a hefty fine imposed by the church or secular court could be ruinous, forcing them into debt or poverty. For a craftsman or merchant, public shame could destroy their reputation and livelihood. The social cost was perhaps the most enduring. Once you were marked by public punishment, that stigma could follow you for years, affecting your children's marriage prospects and your family's place in the community. The process itself could be grueling. Being summoned to court, often located some distance away, meant losing valuable working time. Trials could be lengthy and stressful. Finding witnesses, defending yourself, often without legal representation in the modern sense, and facing your accusers required courage and resources. And if you were found guilty, the execution of the sentence, whether it was paying a fine, standing in the stocks, or enduring a public whipping, less common for simple sexual offenses but possible for related crimes, was a deeply unpleasant and often painful experience. So while the confessional offered a path to private spiritual absolution, the courts, both church and secular, represented the public face of enforcing moral and social order. Getting caught was fundamentally different from voluntarily confessing. It initiated a formal legal process with potentially severe penalties aimed not just at your soul, but at your body, your finances, your reputation, and your place in society. For medieval people navigating their desires and relationships outside the strict confines of approved marriage, this was the ever-present risk, the potential for their private actions to spill into the public sphere and invite the harsh, unyielding judgment of the law and the community. It added a layer of fear and caution to any illicit encounter, a constant reminder that while the night might offer secrecy, the day, and the watchful eyes of authority might bring reckoning. So, you face the very real prospect of public humiliation, fines that could cripple your family, or perhaps even banishment. You remember that feeling from Section 14, the shame cloak, the stocks, the whispers turning into shouts in the market square. Getting caught wasn't just a momentary embarrassment. It could cast a long shadow over your future and the future of your family. A tarnished reputation in the medieval world wasn't something easily scrubbed clean. If you were a woman, getting caught in a sexual transgression could make you virtually unmarriageable, especially if you weren't from the lowest strata of society where such things might be overlooked out of necessity. For men, while often facing less severe social penalties, the economic cost could still be devastating, and public shame eroded the social capital needed to participate in trade or community leadership. The stigma attached to illegitimate children was also a huge consequence. Remember our chat about marriage customs? Legitimacy was paramount for inheritance, status, and social acceptance. A child born outside of recognized marriage, even if the parents eventually married, could face legal and social disadvantages their entire lives. This created immense pressure, not just on the individuals involved in the non-marital relationship, but also on families who relied on marriage alliances and legitimate heirs to maintain their position. Despite all these hurdles, the complex web of confession, penance, public shame, and legal punishment, it's clear that people they still did it. Non-marital sexual relationships didn't vanish. They went underground, became riskier, perhaps required more elaborate planning and secrecy. The enduring human desire for intimacy, companionship, or just plain physical connection often found a way, even within a society determined to police morality so strictly. Think about the sheer number of court records detailing such cases, the countless confessional dialogues, the popular songs and stories that hint at forbidden loves and secret meetings. These systems were trying to put a lid on something that was fundamentally persistent. A particularly quirky tidbit that highlights this persistence is the existence of places like medieval brothels, which were often regulated and taxed by towns, sometimes even licensed by the church itself, despite the church's official condemnation of fornication. This wasn't an endorsement of promiscuity, but rather a pragmatic or perhaps cynical acknowledgement that sexual activity outside of marriage would happen anyway. And it was better in the eyes of some authorities to contain and control it and even profit from it than to pretend it didn't exist. It's a fascinating paradox. Official condemnation side by side with reluctant or even active management of illicit sex. It's like the medieval equivalent of saying, all right, kids, we know you're going to have that party while we're away. Just try not to burn the house down. Historians still argue whether the primary goal of this elaborate system of control, encompassing confession, penance, and secular punishment, was genuinely about saving souls and upholding religious doctrine, or if it was more about maintaining social order, controlling property lines, and reinforcing existing power structures. Were the punishments truly spiritual remediation, or were they effective tools for social conformity in the extraction of wealth through fines? It's likely a mix of both, intertwined in ways that are difficult to fully untangle today. Ultimately, navigating desire outside of marriage in the medieval world was a high-stakes game. It wasn't simply a private choice. It was an act laden with potential spiritual peril, social risk, and tangible legal and economic consequences. You had to weigh the intensity of your feelings against the fear of eternal damnation, the potential for deep shame, the possibility of ruinous fines, and the lasting impact on your family and any children born from the union. For some, the risk was worth it. For others, perhaps, the fear was enough to keep them on the straight and narrow, or at least convince them to try and wait until the official ceremony gave them the green light. It paints a picture of a society wrestling constantly with human nature, attempting to impose order and divine will onto the messy, unpredictable reality of relationships and attraction. And while the systems of control were pervasive and often harsh, they never truly succeeded in eradicating non-marital sex. They simply shaped the landscape of risk, pushing clandestine encounters into the shadows and adding layers of complexity, fear, and consequence to decisions we might view purely through the lens of personal freedom today. Your journey through the medieval world's response to forbidden desires ends here, leaving you, hopefully, with a sense of how deeply intertwined spirituality, law, social status, and human connection were in those distant centuries. Now dim the lights even further if you can. Let your breathing slow down. We've traveled a long road tonight, exploring the complex ways medieval people navigated desire and duty, sin and salvation. The weight of historical detail is lifting now. Feel the sounds of the past fading gently away, like distant church bells or quiet whispers in a confessional booth. There's nothing more you need to hold on to from this journey. Just ease back, release any tension you might be carrying, and let the stillness of the present moment wash over you. The worries of medieval morality, of societal expectations, they belong firmly in the past, tucked away like old manuscripts in a quiet library. Allow your thoughts to drift, soft and formless, like mist over a medieval field at dawn. You are safe, you are comfortable, and sleep is calling.